At 06:15 on July 30th, 1943, Staff Sergeant Michael Aruth crawled into the tail position of B-17 Tandleo at RAF Kimolton, watching a gray English dawn that would carry him 500 miles into Germany. 24 years old, 12 combat missions behind him, 3 confirmed kills already on his record. But today would be different. Today would prove whether everything he believed about aerial gunnery was right, or whether the doctrine that had kept him alive would finally fail him. The tail gunner position measured 4 feet wide and 5 feet long. A bicycle seat served as his workstation. 2 Browning M250 caliber machine guns pointed backward through a plexiglass window. At 25,000 feet, the temperature outside would drop to 60 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. His electrically heated suit was the only thing between survival and death by hypothermia. The 8th Air Force called it the loneliest job in the war. The tail gunner worked alone, separated from the rest of the crew by 40 feet of aluminum fuselage. No one to talk to, no one to help if something went wrong. Just a man, 2 guns, and whatever the Luftwaffe sent his way. The statistics told a brutal story. In the summer of 1943, the average B-17 crew survived 11 missions before being shot down, killed, or captured. Tail gunners died even faster than anyone except ball turret gunners. German fighter pilots preferred attacking from the rear, where the tail position absorbed the first bullets and the first deaths. By July, the 379th Bombardment Group had already lost 9 aircraft in just 2 months of operations. 90 men gone forever. The problem was pure geometry and mathematics. German pilots understood that approaching from behind gave them the longest possible firing window. A Messerschmitt Bf-109, closing at 350 miles per hour from the 6 o'clock position, had nearly 10 seconds to aim and fire before passing the bomber. The tail gunner had those same 10 seconds to hit a target moving at combined speeds approaching 600 miles per hour. The mathematics favored the attacker overwhelmingly. Most tail gunners never got their chance to shoot back. The Focke-Wulf 190 carried 2 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns. A single burst could shred the plexiglass bubble, kill the gunner instantly, and disable the tail controls completely. Bombers without tail protection became easy targets that would be circled, lined up on, and finished off systematically. The standard Army Air Force's gunnery training taught gunners to wait patiently, conserve ammunition carefully, and fire only at ranges under 300 yards. The theory made perfect sense in a classroom. In combat, 300 yards meant the enemy was already shooting at you. By the time a tail gunner opened fire following doctrine, he might already be dead or dying. Aruth had watched it happen on his 6th mission. A B-17 flying off Tandleo's right wing took a direct hit to the tail section. The gunner never fired a single shot. The fighter came in fast, with guns blazing, and the first rounds punched through the plexiglass before the American could react or aim or trigger his weapons. The bomber fell out of formation, trailing black smoke. 8 parachutes emerged and opened against the sky. The tail gunner was not among them. He rode the aircraft down, still strapped in his position. The official doctrine demanded patience and discipline. Aruth questioned everything about it. The fighters attacked from maximum range because they knew American gunners would hold fire and wait. The Luftwaffe pilots had learned the patterns through brutal combat experience. They exploited the training manual like a detailed roadmap to American weaknesses. Michael Aruth was born on January 3, 1919, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the city of steel mills and coal smoke. His father worked at the steel plant for 30 years in the furnaces and rolling mills. His mother raised 4 children in a small house in the industrial district. Michael was the oldest child, which made him responsible from an early age for helping with his younger siblings and contributing to the family. Pittsburgh was a tough city where hard men did hard work for hard pay. The Depression hit the steel industry like a hammer. In 1933, when Michael was only 14 years old, his father was laid off from the plant. The family struggled to keep food on the table and the rent paid. Michael worked odd jobs to help support them. He delivered newspapers before dawn, swept shops after school, and never complained about the burden. He just worked and contributed what he could. He graduated from high school in 1937 at 18 years old. There was no money for college, no scholarships available, no way forward except through work. He started at the same steel mill where his father had spent 3 decades, doing the same long hours in the same hot furnaces, performing the same dangerous work that had broken his father's body over time. But Michael's mind was always elsewhere, always thinking, always learning. He read technical books during his lunch breaks, engineering manuals, mathematics textbooks, physics primers. He taught himself from library books, borrowing them, studying them cover to cover, returning them, and borrowing more. He was completely self-educated beyond high school, intelligent and curious, precise and methodical in his thinking. December 7th, 1941, changed everything for Michael and millions of others. Pearl Harbor brought America into the war. Michael was 22 years old, unmarried, and clearly eligible for the draft. But he didn't wait to be drafted and assigned randomly. He enlisted voluntarily on January 19, 1942, just 6 weeks after the attack, and he specifically volunteered for the Army Air Forces. This wasn't driven by patriotism alone, though he certainly felt that. It wasn't about glory or adventure or seeing the world. It was a practical and calculated decision. The Air Forces desperately needed technical men with mechanical aptitude and mathematical minds. Michael possessed both. The Air Forces would use his skills and abilities fully. The Army infantry would waste them completely by putting him in a foxhole with a rifle. It was a pragmatic choice based on rational analysis. This was Michael Aruth's nature, always practical, always thinking ahead, always calculating the probabilities. In March 1942, Aruth reported to Harlingen Army Gunnery School in southern Texas for 6 intensive weeks of training designed to transform civilians into competent aerial gunners. The curriculum had been established carefully, tested in combat, and was supposedly proven effective. The first week covered complete weapons familiarization with the Browning M2 50 caliber machine gun that would become his primary tool and weapon. The Browning M2 weighed 84 pounds and measured 65 inches in length. Its rate of fire reached 800 rounds per minute when functioning properly. Its muzzle velocity was 2,900 feet per second, sending half-inch diameter bullets downrange with tremendous energy. Its effective range was listed officially as 1,000 yards, though accuracy degraded significantly beyond 600 yards under combat conditions. The students spent endless hours disassembling and reassembling the weapon, first slowly and carefully, then faster under time pressure, then blindfolded to simulate darkness or equipment failure, until the process became completely automatic and muscle memory took over entirely. Aruth excelled at this mechanical work. His mind understood machinery instinctively. He could visualize how the pieces fit together, why they fit that specific way, and how they worked as an integrated system. He consistently posted the top scores in his class with perfect timing on every drill. The instructors noticed his talent immediately. The second week covered ballistics in exhaustive detail, teaching trajectory, lead angles, and deflection shooting. This was pure mathematics and physics, which was exactly Aruth's specialty and strength. The instructors explained that a .50 caliber bullet travels at 2,900 feet per second after leaving the barrel. A target aircraft typically moves at 300 miles per hour, which translates to 440 feet per second. Therefore, you must aim ahead of the target by a calculated amount. You must compute the lead angle. You must account for wind speed and direction, for altitude and air density, for temperature effects on ballistics. Multiple variables, complex equations, constant calculations. Aruth absorbed all of this material effortlessly, understood it instinctively, and could calculate the solutions almost instantly in his head. The instructors were genuinely impressed. They told him he was a natural at aerial gunnery, someone who understood both the mechanical systems and the mathematical principles perfectly. The third week introduced tactics, and this is where serious problems began to emerge in Aruth's mind. The instructors taught the official doctrine, presenting the gunnery manual as established truth. This was official Army Air Forces doctrine based supposedly on extensive European combat experience analyzed by the British, studied by the Germans, and observed during the Spanish Civil War. Data had been collected carefully. Statistics had been analyzed thoroughly. Conclusions had been drawn definitively. The doctrine was absolutely clear and specific. Wait patiently. Conserve ammunition carefully. Fire in short, controlled bursts. Engage targets only at ranges under 300 yards. The reasoning behind these rules seemed completely sound. Ammunition was strictly limited to 800 rounds per gun position. Accuracy mattered far more than raw volume of fire. A disciplined gunner who followed the rules could make 800 rounds last an entire mission from takeoff to landing. The theory was logical and sound in the controlled environment of a classroom. But Aruth began questioning the doctrine almost immediately because reality would prove dramatically different from theory. The doctrine didn't adequately account for one absolutely critical factor that would mean the difference between life and death: the brutal geometry of aerial combat. The instructors taught doctrine. Aruth studied it carefully and listened attentively, but he also questioned it silently and constantly. The doctrine specified waiting until 300 yards before opening fire. But why exactly 300 yards? The official answer was that accuracy became reliable at that range. Long-range shots beyond 300 yards wasted valuable ammunition. This was technically true, but the instructors didn't teach something crucial. The manual didn't adequately explain the geometric reality of the combat situation. Aruth began calculating the problem independently in his mind. Consider the tactical situation carefully. An enemy fighter attacking from behind, approaching from the 6 o'clock position directly astern. A Messerschmitt Bf-109 or Focke-Wulf 19 closing at 350 miles per hour, while the bomber flies straight and level at only 200 miles per hour. This creates a combined closure rate of 550 miles per hour between the two aircraft, which translates mathematically to 808 feet per second of closing speed. Now apply this to the 300-yard doctrine. 300 yards equals exactly 900 feet of separation. At 808 feet per second of closure rate, the fighter reaches firing position in just 1.1 seconds, barely more than 1 second. This is almost no time at all to acquire the target, aim precisely, and fire accurately. But here's what really mattered for survival. The fighter pilot had approximately 10 full seconds to aim carefully, fire multiple bursts, and pass by the bomber before breaking away. The tail gunner theoretically had those same 10 seconds to hit an enemy target that was moving at combined speeds approaching 600 miles per hour. But most tail gunners never got those 10 seconds because of the fatal flaw in the doctrine. The fighter opened fire first, typically at 600 yards or beyond, while the American gunner waited patiently as trained. German pilots had extensively studied American tactics through combat experience and intelligence reports. They knew with certainty that the gunners would wait until 300 yards, so they ruthlessly exploited this predictable behavior. They opened fire early at 600 yards, pouring devastating 20mm cannon shells and 13mm machine gun rounds into the bomber formations, while the Americans dutifully held their triggers as trained. By the time the tail gunners finally started shooting at 300 yards, the damage was often already done and irreversible. The plexiglass bubble was shredded by cannon fragments. The gunner was dead or dying from wounds. The tail control cables were severed by bullets. The bomber was defenseless and doomed. Aruth saw this fundamental problem with crystal clarity, even sitting in the gunnery school classroom before his first combat mission, before his first sight of an enemy fighter, before his first shot fired in anger. He saw the catastrophic flaw built into the doctrine. He began calculating a better solution, a different approach that might actually keep him alive. The doctrine commanded waiting until 300 yards. But what would happen if you fired much earlier, at 6 or 7 or even 800 yards? What if you disrupted the enemy attack before the fighter pilot could establish a stable firing solution? Suppressive fire, defensive fire, harassment fire, force the enemy to maneuver evasively, degrade his accuracy significantly. Even if your rounds weren't hitting the target directly, even if your tracers were falling short initially, the enemy pilot would see bright tracers streaming toward his aircraft. He would react instinctively and immediately. He would maneuver defensively. The carefully planned attack would be disrupted. The firing solution would be ruined. He would have to break off and start the entire approach again. The fundamental problem with this aggressive approach was ammunition consumption. 800 rounds total per gun position sounds like substantial firepower until you divide it mathematically by the expected number of attacks during a typical deep penetration mission into Germany. 15 separate attacks, 20 attacks, sometimes 30 or more attacks over the course of 6 hours. At 50 rounds expended per defensive burst, the mathematics turned absolutely brutal. 16 bursts and your guns were empty. You were defenseless. You were dead. A gunner who fired early and aggressively might completely run dry of ammunition before the mission ended, and dead men obviously have no use whatsoever for carefully conserved reserve ammunition sitting unused in the bins. But Aruth calculated the equation differently using cold logic. A gunner who carefully conserved his ammunition but died during the third fighter attack of the mission had also made a catastrophically poor bargain. Dead was dead regardless. The doctrine fundamentally assumed the enemy would cooperate with American training procedures. The enemy absolutely did not cooperate. The doctrine assumed perfect combat conditions. Combat was never perfect. The doctrine taught survival through patience and discipline. Aruth calculated that survival actually required aggression and disruption, but at this point he was only calculating and theorizing in his mind, not yet testing under fire, not yet proving under combat conditions. His training was complete and successful. Now came the ultimate real test, actual combat, real life and real death. The abstract numbers and theories would become intensely personal. The intellectual questions would become immediate survival. In May 1942, Aruth shipped across the Atlantic to England and was assigned to the 379th Bombardment Group, specifically the 527th Bomb Squadron, stationed at RAF Kimolton in Northamptonshire, about 60 miles north of London. This was an American bomber base carved into the British countryside with its green fields, ancient villages, and medieval churches. The war seemed distant and strangely peaceful here, which was utterly deceptive because the war was actually very close and very deadly. Every single day, formations of bombers took off headed for Germany. Some of those formations returned in the afternoon. Some bombers didn't return at all. The 379th Bombardment Group had been formed recently in January 1943. The group was still new to combat, inexperienced in tactics, learning hard lessons, and bleeding experienced crews constantly. The group's first combat mission flew on January 7, 1943, targeting the industrial city of Bremen in Germany. 3 aircraft were shot down and lost. 30 American men were killed, captured, or missing. The second mission flew on January 23rd against the heavily defended Lorient submarine pens on the French coast. 2 more aircraft were lost. 20 more men gone forever. The third mission in early February brought additional heavy losses. A terrible pattern was being established. Constant attrition, steady bleeding. Replacement crews arrived constantly from the United States to fill the gaps in the roster. Some of these replacement crews survived their first combat mission successfully. Many didn't survive. By June 1943, when Aruth finally arrived in England, the 379th Group had already lost 23 complete aircraft and 230 men in just 5 brutal months of combat operations. The numbers were absolutely sobering, but grimly necessary. Someone had to fly the missions. Someone had to fight the war. Someone had to die so that others might eventually live, so the war might eventually end, so Nazi Germany might eventually fall. It was a simple strategic equation with brutal human mathematics. Aruth fully understood this reality. He accepted it completely. He prepared himself mentally for it. His crew assignment placed him aboard B-17F Tandlio with an experienced and capable crew. The aircraft commander and pilot was Lieutenant Elmer Bendener, who also served as the navigator. Bendener was an intellectual, a writer, a careful thinker who observed everything closely. The co-pilot was Bill Scott, solid and reliable in the right seat. The flight engineer was competent and steady. The bombardier was John Murphy, known for his precision and intense focus on the target. The radio operator was Frank Walls. The waist gunners were Tom Martin and Joe Hansen. The ball turret gunner was Willie Edson, the smallest man on the crew who could fit into that cramped and terrifying position. The top turret gunner was Carl Moore, and Michael Aruth took the tail gunner position, the loneliest job in the aircraft, the most isolated position in the crew. But Aruth actually preferred the isolation and loneliness. It allowed him space to think clearly, to calculate carefully, to test his theories independently without distraction or interference. It was absolutely perfect for his methodical mind. On June 22, 1943, Michael Aruth flew his first combat mission. The target was the Saint-Nazaire submarine pens on the French Atlantic coast, where German U-boats operated freely and threatened Allied shipping constantly. These concrete fortifications had to be destroyed or at least damaged. The mission had to succeed despite the risks. The mission briefing began at 0600 hours with the group intelligence officer presenting detailed maps, reconnaissance photographs, known flak concentrations, nearby fighter bases, and expected enemy opposition, which was described optimistically as moderate. Takeoff was scheduled for 0830 hours with 180 B-17 flying fortresses participating in the raid. RAF Kimolton would contribute 18 bombers to the total force, and Tandlio was definitely among them. The formation assembly process consumed 90 long minutes as individual bombers took off, climbed, circled the assembly point, gradually joined their assigned groups, and formed the precise combat box defensive formation. This formation was designed specifically to provide mutual protection and interlocking fields of defensive fire from hundreds of machine guns. At least that was the theory taught in training. Combat reality would consistently prove different and more chaotic. The Channel crossing proceeded uneventfully at first. France appeared below as a beautiful green patchwork of agricultural fields, winding rivers, and connecting roads. It looked peaceful and pastoral from 20,000 feet. It was anything but peaceful. German anti-aircraft fire began almost immediately, with distinctive black puffs of smoke exploding at their altitude. The shells were bursting and throwing deadly shrapnel fragments. The flak wasn't particularly accurate at this range, but it was absolutely frightening regardless. Aruth watched it carefully, seeing combat flak for the first time in reality rather than in training films. This wasn't his imagination or a training exercise. This was real. Live explosive shells were bursting close around them, physically shaking the aircraft with each near miss. This was actual combat. This was real war. Then the Luftwaffe fighters arrived in force. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s came diving and slashing through the bomber formation, attacking aggressively from multiple angles simultaneously. 12 o'clock high from directly ahead, 3 o'clock level from the right side, 6 o'clock low from behind and below, 9 o'clock high from the left. The attacks came from everywhere at once in coordinated waves. Aruth's position in the tail gave him responsibility for the 6 o'clock rear sector, and he saw an enemy fighter approaching steadily from 6 o'clock low in a textbook perfect tail attack, exactly as the training films and lectures had described in detail. The official doctrine commanded waiting until the range closed to 300 yards. Aruth waited and followed doctrine precisely. This was his very first combat mission. He would obey the orders fully, learn the actual system through experience, and question it later after surviving. The enemy fighter closed steadily. 500 yards separation, 400 yards, 300 yards exactly. Aruth squeezed both triggers and fired a short, disciplined burst of exactly 20 rounds as trained. The tracers arced outward in a bright stream, but fell short of the target and missed completely. The German fighter pilot fired his 20mm cannons in response. Boom, boom, boom. 3 shells passed close. The rounds missed Tandleo, but the margin was terrifyingly small, far too close for comfort. The fighter flashed past at tremendous speed and was gone in seconds. Aruth was still alive and uninjured, but his mind was already racing and questioning. The doctrine had completely failed to protect him or the aircraft. It had only allowed him to react defensively after the enemy initiated. The German fighter was already shooting when Aruth finally fired. The doctrine had fatally delayed his defensive response and had almost gotten him killed. First mission, first actual combat, first validation of his theoretical questions about doctrine. The Saint-Nazaire mission returned to England successfully. Tandleo landed intact with the crew alive and uninjured. But not everyone in the formation was equally lucky. 2 aircraft from the 527th Squadron were shot down and lost over France. 20 American men never returned to base. They were dead, captured, or missing. The mission debriefing began at 1600 hours with intelligence officers methodically questioning each crew. What did you observe? Where exactly? When precisely? How many enemy fighters? What types and markings? Aruth reported his experience truthfully. A single engagement in the tail position. 1 Messerschmitt Bf-109 attacking from 6 o'clock low. He fired at 300 yards as doctrine required. He missed the target. The fighter fired and also missed. The fighter passed and disengaged. The intelligence officers noted this information in their records and moved efficiently to the next crew for questioning. It was completely routine and standard procedure. But it wasn't routine or standard for Aruth at all. This had been his first real combat, his first actual test under fire. The doctrine had demonstrably failed him. The enemy fighter had fired first and initiated the engagement. Aruth had only reacted defensively, not initiated aggressively. The doctrine commanded conserving ammunition carefully, waiting patiently, taking only precise shots at close range. But waiting had nearly killed him today. The fighter was already shooting heavy cannon shells. Those 20mm rounds would absolutely kill with a single direct hit. The thin plexiglass shield was essentially nothing against that kind of firepower. The aluminum fuselage might as well be tissue paper. The doctrine fundamentally assumed the gunner would survive the initial approach phase intact, calmly establish his precise aim, and fire accurately. But what if the gunner was already dead before he could aim properly? What if the plexiglass canopy was already shattered before he could pull the triggers? What if the tail controls were already severed before he could defend the aircraft? The doctrine assumed survival was likely. Aruth now questioned that fundamental assumption based on direct personal experience. That evening in the enlisted mess hall, the combat crews gathered to eat, decompress from the stress, and discuss the day's mission quietly among themselves. Aruth listened carefully to the other tail gunners talking about their experiences. They were all telling essentially the same story with minor variations. An enemy fighter attacked their position. They waited as doctrine absolutely required. The German fired first every single time. They survived by pure luck alone, not by superior skill, not by following effective doctrine. Just random luck. Some lived, some died. The difference was luck. But luck wasn't a reliable strategy for survival. Luck wasn't repeatable mission after mission. Luck eventually ran out for everyone. Aruth realized something critically important that night. The doctrine taught survival through rigid discipline and strict adherence to procedures, but that discipline meant waiting passively, and waiting passively meant dying frequently, at least sometimes, often enough to create unacceptable casualties. There absolutely had to be a different approach. There had to be a better method. He had to calculate it precisely. He had to test it carefully. He had to prove it conclusively through results. On June 29th, Aruth flew his second combat mission. The target was Villacoublay Airfield, located near Paris, a major Luftwaffe fighter base that had to be destroyed to reduce enemy air strength. Tandleo was assigned to the mission, and Aruth prepared himself carefully. But this time would be deliberately different. This time he would actively experiment. He wouldn't follow doctrine blindly without question. He would test his alternative theory under actual combat conditions. He had 800 rounds of ammunition total between his two guns. The established doctrine said to conserve it strictly, to fire only at 300 yards range, to use only short controlled bursts. Aruth decided completely differently for this mission. He would fire much earlier than doctrine allowed. He would use longer sustained bursts. He would observe what actually happened. The risk was depleting ammunition too quickly. The potential reward was actual survival. He was absolutely willing to accept that calculated risk. Takeoff proceeded at 0900 hours. The massive formation assembled over England. They crossed the English Channel. France appeared below. They approached the target area. Then Luftwaffe fighters appeared, and there were significantly more enemy aircraft than at Saint-Nazaire. Many more. Aggressive Focke-Wulf 190s, fast and heavily armed with cannons and machine guns. 4 enemy fighters approached Tandleo from 6 o'clock high in a classic coordinated formation attack. The doctrine commanded waiting patiently. Aruth completely ignored it. He fired immediately at 700 yards range with a long, sustained burst of 50 rounds continuous. The tracers streamed outward, falling short initially, but rapidly climbing and walking steadily toward the targets. The enemy fighter pilots clearly saw the bright tracers coming toward them. The rounds weren't hitting yet, but they were definitely coming closer. The pilots reacted instinctively and immediately as Aruth had predicted. They broke their tight formation apart. They maneuvered evasively. The carefully planned attack was completely disrupted. They had to regroup and start their entire approach over again. Precious time was wasted. The optimal approach angle was lost. The firing solution was degraded significantly. They eventually fired their weapons, but only while maneuvering defensively. Their accuracy was drastically poor. The rounds missed Tandleo widely by dozens of yards, passing high and to the side, completely ineffective. A second attack wave approached. Aruth repeated his new tactic precisely, firing at 800 yards range with 60 rounds. Exactly the same result. The tracers reached out. The fighters maneuvered away. The attack was disrupted before it developed. A third wave came. Same tactic, same result. A fourth wave, same outcome. 5 separate attacks total during the bomb run. 300 rounds of ammunition expended aggressively. But Tandleo wasn't hit even once. Not a single bullet or shell fragment struck the aircraft. Aruth was completely alive and totally uninjured. His theory was actually working in combat. The established doctrine was demonstrably wrong, but the mission continued relentlessly. More enemy fighters kept coming in waves, more attacks kept developing from multiple angles. Aruth had fired early 5 times. 300 precious rounds were already expended. Only 500 rounds remained in his ammunition supply. A serious problem was emerging clearly. The doctrine stated that 800 rounds were sufficient for an entire mission if conserved carefully, if fired precisely, if you waited for close range. But Aruth wasn't conserving carefully. He wasn't waiting for close range. He wasn't firing precise short bursts at 300 yards. He was firing early with long suppressive bursts at extended ranges. His ammunition was depleting dangerously fast. The mathematics turned brutal again. 500 rounds remaining. The mission was only half over. The return journey was the same distance with the same fighters waiting and the same attacks coming. He expected at least 15 more separate attacks before reaching England. 500 divided by 15 equals 33 rounds per burst. That wasn't sufficient for suppressive fire. That wasn't effective for disruption. That wasn't adequate for survival. Aruth calculated his 3 possible options carefully. Option 1, return immediately to standard doctrine. Wait until 300 yards. Fire short bursts. Conserve remaining ammunition strictly. Survive the return flight through discipline. The problem was that doctrine had nearly failed at Saint-Nazaire and almost killed him. Why should he trust it now after that experience? Option 2, continue the aggressive early fire approach and accept the risk of complete ammunition depletion. The problem was that running completely dry mid-mission meant certain death. Defenseless aircraft were easy kills. Option 3, intelligently modify the approach mid-mission. Fire early only on clearly important maximum threats. Conserve ammunition on obviously lesser threats. Be calculated, be selective, be tactical. Use judgment and experience. Aruth chose option 3 immediately. It was pragmatic, mathematical, and completely survival-focused. Not all enemy threats were equal. Not all attacks were the same level of danger. Some fighter pilots were clearly better and more experienced. Some were obviously worse and less skilled. Some were aggressive and committed. Some were cautious and tentative. Some were accurate with their fire. Some were sloppy and wasteful. He had to identify them quickly. He had to prioritize them correctly. He had to calculate appropriate responses. This was real combat. This was actual survival. This was the pure mathematics of life and death. The return journey began as they left the target area and headed west through Belgium and France toward the Channel and England and home and safety. But they weren't safe yet. The Luftwaffe was waiting with fresh fighters, rested pilots, and full ammunition loads. The returning bombers were exhausted with low fuel, depleted ammunition, some wounded aircraft, and vulnerable stragglers. They were perfect targets. The first attack came from 6 o'clock level. A single Focke-Wulf fighter with an experienced pilot in a steady professional approach with proper formation discipline. This was clearly dangerous. Aruth identified it as a maximum threat. He fired at 700 yards with a long, aggressive burst of 70 rounds. The tracers connected solidly, sparking visibly on the engine cowling. The pilot broke away immediately, trailing smoke and descending. The threat was eliminated completely. 430 rounds remained. The second attack involved 4 fighters from 6 o'clock high. They were aggressive and fast, but also sloppy with loose formation and wild, inaccurate firing. This was less dangerous. Aruth fired at 300 yards with only a short warning burst of 20 rounds, not trying to kill, but just to harass and intimidate. The fighters broke away early, clearly intimidated by the earlier aggressive defense. They had seen what this particular American tail gunner could do. Better to avoid him and survive. The attack was aborted. 410 rounds remained. The third attack came from 2 fighters at 6 o'clock low. This was extremely dangerous because the low angle was very difficult, right at the limit of the tail gun's depression range. Aruth fired anyway, depressing his guns to absolute maximum with 50 rounds streaming downward. The tracers forced the fighters even lower below the bomber, where they couldn't physically establish a proper firing angle. They passed underneath harmlessly. 360 rounds remained. A clear pattern was emerging from this experience. For genuinely dangerous threats from experienced pilots in good formations, he used early aggressive fire with long bursts to either kill them or eliminate them as threats. For lesser threats from average or inexperienced pilots, he used late fire with short bursts to conserve precious ammunition. It was calculated. It was selective. It was tactical. It was mathematical warfare. 4 more attacks developed during the long return journey. Aruth carefully varied his response to match each specific threat level. He conserved his ammunition as much as possible while still protecting the aircraft. When they finally reached England and landed, he had exactly 200 rounds remaining. But he was definitely alive. Tandleo was completely intact. The crew was totally safe. His theory had been validated under combat. The standard doctrine had been seriously challenged. A better solution was clearly emerging. After landing at Kimolton at 1600 hours, Tandleo parked at its assigned hardstand, and the exhausted crew climbed out, relieved and grateful to be alive. The ground crew immediately swarmed around to inspect the aircraft thoroughly, count the bullet holes, and assess the battle damage. There was minimal damage visible. Only a few holes and nothing critical to flight systems. This was highly unusual because most returning aircraft were absolutely shredded with damage. Tandleo was pristine by direct comparison. Lieutenant Bendiner, the navigator and intellectual observer of the crew, noticed something unusual about the mission. He approached Aruth privately after the debriefing session. He observed that Aruth had fired a great deal of ammunition during the mission, far more than standard doctrine recommended. It wasn't an accusation of wrongdoing. It was simply an observation of fact. Aruth confirmed this was true. Bendiner noted that despite the heavy ammunition expenditure, Tandleo hadn't been hit at all during the entire mission. This was significant. Bendiner asked what Aruth was doing differently from standard procedures. Aruth explained his tactic of firing early with long bursts to disrupt attacks before they fully developed. Bendiner thought carefully about this explanation. He was a navigator and a trained mathematician. He understood the underlying logic immediately. Bendiner concluded it made complete sense. An enemy fighter couldn't hit the bomber accurately if he was maneuvering defensively. Aruth agreed. Bendina noted that the official doctrine said to wait. Aruth confirmed this. Bendina observed that Aruth clearly wasn't waiting anymore. Aruth confirmed he was not. Bendina made a command decision. He told Aruth to keep doing exactly what he was doing, whatever it was, because it was clearly working. Aruth agreed to continue. This was validation, not official validation from headquarters or formal doctrine change, but the aircraft commander was noticing results. The crew was noticing survival. The results spoke louder than regulations. Tandleo survived repeatedly. Other aircraft didn't survive. Maybe it was luck. Maybe it was skill. Most likely it was effective tactics. Bendina was a navigator, a trained observer who recognized patterns and analyzed results carefully. He saw clearly that Aruth was doing something fundamentally different from standard procedure, something that was actually working in combat. He didn't order him to stop the deviation. He explicitly ordered him to continue it. This was implicit command approval, not official Air Force doctrine, but practical combat reality. Survival mattered more than strict regulations. Actual results mattered more than theoretical doctrine. Aruth would continue his methods. Bendina would support him completely. The entire crew would benefit from the protection. On July 2nd, the third mission targeted Le Mans in France, an important aircraft factory that had to be destroyed to reduce German production. The bombers assembled massively, took off in sequence, crossed the Channel, and reached the French coast. Luftwaffe fighters appeared immediately in overwhelming numbers with an aggressive, well-coordinated mass attack. Dozens of enemy fighters from all angles simultaneously. It was complete chaos. Tandleo was attacked from 6 o'clock. Aruth fired early again at 700 and 800 yards range with long bursts of suppressive fire. The fighters broke repeatedly under the defensive fire. They couldn't establish their approach properly. They couldn't aim with any accuracy. They fired wildly and missed completely. Tandleo escaped all damage once again. But other bombers in the formation weren't nearly as lucky. 3 aircraft from the 527th Squadron were shot down and lost. 30 men were gone forever. At the debriefing session, the intelligence officers asked their standard questions about enemy fighter numbers, aircraft types, and engagement ranges. Then, a new question was directed specifically at the tail gunner position. The officer asked how much ammunition Aruth had fired. 600 rounds, Aruth replied honestly. There was a significant pause. The officer repeated the number with obvious skepticism. 600 rounds, Aruth confirmed. The officer stated that mission doctrine recommended a maximum of 400 rounds for the entire mission. Aruth acknowledged this was correct. The officer asked why there was such excessive expenditure beyond doctrine limits. Aruth explained his reasoning about early fire, attack disruption, and survival improvement. The intelligence officer was clearly skeptical about this unauthorized deviation from doctrine, but took careful notes and moved on to question the next crew. Later that evening, in the enlisted mess hall, other tail gunners approached Aruth privately. They had heard rumors about his tactics, about firing early against doctrine, about how it seemed to work consistently. They had questions. How early do you fire? How much do you fire? Why does it actually work? Aruth explained the underlying geometry, the closure rates, the attack disruption principle, and the suppressive fire concept. Some gunners remained skeptical because doctrine was doctrine, supposedly tested and proven effective. Other gunners were genuinely interested because the doctrine was clearly getting men killed, and they were willing to try absolutely anything different. Survival was the only priority that mattered. Aruth became an informal teacher, completely unofficial and unauthorized. He explained his theory clearly, shared his combat tactics openly, discussed calculated risks honestly, explained selective engagement principles, and taught ammunition management techniques. A small group formed gradually, just a few gunners who were open-minded enough, desperate enough, willing to experiment, willing to learn new methods, and desperately willing to survive. This is exactly how military doctrine actually changes in wartime. Not top-down from headquarters issuing new manuals, bottom-up from combat survivors sharing lessons, one gunner learning from another, one mission validating a new approach, one survival proving a concept, one lesson spreading quietly until eventually everyone knows and overall survival rates improve measurably. On July 10th, the fourth mission targeted the major city of Hamburg in Germany. This was a deep penetration mission, a very long flight with many expected enemy fighters. It was an extremely dangerous mission, and absolutely everyone knew it. The mission briefing was notably somber. Expected losses were projected as very high. The crews prepared themselves mentally. Aruth followed his now standard routine carefully. He checked his guns thoroughly, loaded his ammunition supply with 800 fresh rounds, and settled into the uncomfortable tail position. It was cramped, cold, lonely, but perfect for his focused work. The massive formation assembled over England took off in sequence and climbed to 25,000 feet, where the temperature was 60 degrees below zero. The electrically heated suit was working, but barely. His hands were numb anyway. His feet were worse. But being cold meant being alive. Being cold was acceptable. They crossed the Channel, flew over Holland, and penetrated deep into Germany, deep into enemy territory. The Luftwaffe fighters appeared in massive numbers, 50 enemy fighters visible, 100 fighters, maybe more. They were coordinating a true mass attack with a clear plan to systematically destroy bombers, completely overwhelm defenses, break the formation apart, and methodically pick off stragglers. These were standard proven Luftwaffe tactics. They were effective and absolutely deadly. The first attack wave had 12 fighters from 6 o'clock level in a very tight formation with clearly experienced pilots. This was extremely dangerous. Aruth fired immediately at 800 yards with a long, aggressive burst of 80 rounds. The tracers streamed outward. The lead fighter was hit solidly and started smoking badly, rolling and falling away. The tight formation broke apart completely and scattered. The coordinated attack was totally disrupted. The immediate threat was eliminated. 720 rounds remained. The second wave had 8 fighters attacking from high and diving fast. Aruth fired at 700 yards, tracking carefully and leading the target with 60 rounds. 2 fighters were hit and started sparking visibly, breaking away damaged. The others aborted their attacks immediately and dove away to safety. 660 rounds remained. The third wave came from low at a very difficult angle near the gun's limits. Aruth fired anyway at maximum depression, with 50 rounds streaming downward. He forced the attacking fighters even lower below the bomber, where they simply couldn't angle up properly. They passed harmlessly underneath. 610 rounds remained. The pattern continued for the next hour. The fight lasted continuously. Aruth fired early on absolutely every attack, disrupting and preventing them systematically. Tandleo wasn't hit even once. Not a single bullet or shell struck the aircraft. The crew definitely noticed. The pilot definitely noticed. Everyone definitely noticed. Aruth's tactics were working consistently, repeatably, scientifically, mission after mission. But careful comparison with other aircraft in the formation told a very different and darker story. Aircraft number 3 on Tandleo's right wing had a different tail gunner who was still following standard doctrine perfectly, waiting and conserving carefully. He was attacked from 6 o'clock, He waited until exactly 300 yards as trained. He fired a precise 20 rounds in a short, controlled burst. He missed the target completely. The enemy fighter fired back and hit him. The 20mm cannon shells shredded the tail section instantly. The gunner was killed immediately. The aircraft continued but was now completely defenseless. A second fighter attacked with absolutely no resistance. More hits came. The aircraft fell away. The crew bailed out. 7 parachutes emerged, 8 crew members total. The tail gunner was dead. Aircraft number 7 in the lead also had a gunner following doctrine with similar tragic results. He was attacked. He waited. He fired late. He was hit first. He was wounded seriously. He continued fighting bravely. He was hit again. He was killed. The aircraft survived. The gunner didn't. A clear pattern was emerging from the statistics. Doctrine gunners were dying at high rates. The non-doctrine gunner was surviving consistently. This was Michael Aruth, either an impossible statistical anomaly or definitive proof of concept. In the 9 total missions flown by the 379th Group's 527th Squadron, there had been 18 complete aircraft losses representing 180 men killed, captured, or missing across only 27 missions flown, which calculated to an attrition rate of 67%. This was completely unacceptable and absolutely unsustainable. Something had to change fundamentally. Meanwhile, Tandleo, with Aruth as the tail gunner, had flown 9 missions with 0 losses, 0 casualties, and 0 serious damage to the aircraft. Was this pure coincidence? Maybe. Was it just luck? Perhaps. Was it superior tactics? Probably. The statistical results strongly suggested it. The combat evidence clearly indicated it. The mathematics demonstrated it. The standard doctrine was wrong. Aruth's approach was right. The critical question was whether anyone in authority would listen, whether anyone would officially change the doctrine, and whether anyone else would live because of it. Time would tell. Meanwhile, Aruth kept fighting, kept firing, kept surviving mission after mission, and kept teaching others informally, unofficially, but extremely effectively. On July 15th, between combat missions during a maintenance day, the ground crew was working on routine Tandleo maintenance. This included work on engines, flight controls, defensive systems, and ammunition loading. 800 rounds for the tail position, as always. But lately, there had been an unusual and notable pattern. Ammunition expenditure was consistently high, very high. 600 rounds per mission, 700, sometimes all 800 rounds. The crew chief definitely noticed this anomaly. Master Sergeant Thompson was 38 years old, a career military man with 20 years of service in the Army Air Forces. He knew aircraft inside and out. He knew systems thoroughly. He knew ammunition procedures completely. Standard doctrine called for a maximum of 400 rounds expended per mission. Aruth was consistently using double that amount. Thompson approached Aruth to discuss the issue. He noted that Aruth needed to discuss ammunition usage. He pointed out that Aruth was using far too much, double the standard amount. He asked why this was happening. Aruth explained once again about early fire, attack disruption, and improved survival rates through aggressive defense. Thompson listened but remained skeptical. He stated that doctrine existed for good reasons. It had been tested extensively and supposedly proven effective through combat. Aruth countered that the doctrine was clearly getting gunners killed at unacceptable rates. Thompson acknowledged this might be true. He suggested that maybe the gunners weren't following doctrine properly. Aruth pointed out simply that he was still alive after 9 missions. Thompson thought carefully about this fact. Thompson observed that other gunners who were following doctrine precisely were dying. Aruth confirmed that yes, some were definitely dying while following doctrine. Thompson noted that Aruth was not following doctrine but was clearly living. Aruth confirmed this was true so far. Thompson considered all of this carefully. He was fundamentally a practical man. Results mattered more than theory. Aruth was alive after 9 missions. Many others were dead. It was a simple equation with clear results. Thompson made his decision. He told Aruth to keep doing exactly what he was doing, but he cautioned him to be very careful. Ammunition was strictly limited. If he ran completely dry, he would be dead. Aruth confirmed he understood completely. Thompson dismissed him to return to his duties. The conversation was over, but it was highly significant. The crew chief had noticed the deviation. The crew chief had implicitly approved it. Not officially, not in writing, but practically. This is how the military often works in combat. Unofficially, practically. Results-focused, survival-oriented. Aruth would continue his methods. His tactics were validated by yet another authority figure. It was another significant step toward eventual doctrine change, toward improved survival, toward final victory. On July 17th, a mission targeted Hanover and its aircraft factories deep in Germany. It was a long, dangerous flight with extremely heavy opposition that was both expected and fully realized. Enemy fighters were everywhere in huge numbers, hundreds of them in coordinated waves. They were determined, aggressive, and absolutely deadly. Tandlio was attacked repeatedly throughout the mission. Aruth fired constantly, early and with long bursts, disrupting attacks and surviving consistently. But there were increasingly close calls, closer than any before. One particular fighter, a Focke-Wulf 190, with a clearly experienced pilot who was aggressive and completely determined, attacked from 6 o'clock. Aruth fired at 800 yards with a long burst. The tracers streamed outward toward the target as usual, but this fighter didn't break away as others had. He continued forward relentlessly while firing back with his 20mm cannon. Boom, boom, boom. The rounds passed dangerously close. Aruth kept firing continuously. The tracers connected repeatedly, sparking on the fighter's engine and wings. The engine started smoking badly, but the fighter kept coming anyway. He was dedicated, suicidal, desperate, determined to complete his attack. Aruth kept firing without stopping. 150 rounds, 200 rounds. Tracers were everywhere, hitting repeatedly and damaging progressively. The fighter was smoking very heavily, but still coming at 300 yards, 200 yards, 50 yards. Finally, the fighter broke away, rolling aside while trailing heavy smoke and visible fire and falling toward the ground. But it had passed terrifyingly close, only 20 feet away. Aruth could see the pilot's face clearly. He was young, determined, and dying. The fighter crashed into the German countryside. Aruth was breathing hard, his heart pounding violently. That had been far too close. He checked his ammunition status. 500 rounds expended in that single prolonged engagement. 300 rounds remained. The mission was only half over. This was a serious problem. He had been too aggressive, too determined to kill, rather than just disrupt. He needed to modify his approach again. He needed to conserve better. He needed to calculate more carefully. Survival required ammunition. He absolutely had to balance aggression with conservation, always balancing perfectly to survive. On July 18th, there was a stand-down with no combat mission scheduled. It was a maintenance day for aircraft and a rest day for crews. Aruth used this precious time for thinking, calculating, and refining his evolving theory. Yesterday's close call had been far too close. The fundamental problem was ammunition management. He had fired too much in a single engagement, 500 rounds, which was clearly excessive and unnecessary. The fighter would have broken eventually under sustained fire. He didn't need absolutely continuous fire. He needed controlled bursts. He had to refine his approach further. He had to calculate even better. He had to survive even longer. His basic theory was definitely working. Early fire disrupted attacks before they developed fully. This had been proven over multiple missions with consistent results, but the execution still needed adjustment. Not all attacks were equal. Not all threats were identical. Some required maximum heavy fire in true kill or be killed situations. Some required only minimum warning fire for disruption and intimidation. He had to identify threats quickly. He had to categorize them accurately. He had to respond appropriately to each category. He developed refined threat categories. Category 1 consisted of experienced pilots in very tight formations making proper attacks. These were extremely dangerous and required maximum fire with 700-yard engagement range, long sustained bursts, killing if possible, and disruption as minimum acceptable. Category 2 consisted of average pilots in standard formations making normal attacks. These were dangerous and required suppressive fire with 600-yard engagement, medium bursts, disruption primarily, and killing secondary. Category 3 consisted of inexperienced pilots in loose, sloppy formations making poor attacks. These were less dangerous and required warning fire with 400-yard engagement, short bursts, ammunition conservation, and intimidation. This was categorization, identification, and appropriate response. It was calculated warfare. It was tactical thinking. It was survival-focused mathematics. This was the refinement, the evolution, the science of combat that Aruth was personally developing, testing, and proving mission by mission. This is how doctrine truly changes. One gunner, one thought, one mission, one survival, repeated, refined, perfected. On July 20th, Aruth was approached privately by 3 other tail gunners from the 527 the squadron, Corporal Jenkins, Corporal Martinez, Sergeant Williams. All were experienced combat survivors who were genuinely interested in learning. They had heard rumors that Aruth was firing early against standard doctrine. They asked if this was true. Aruth confirmed it was. They asked if it actually worked in combat. Aruth pointed out simply that he was still alive after multiple missions. They noted that doctrine said to wait. Aruth observed that doctrine was clearly getting gunners killed at unacceptable rates. There was a meaningful pause. They all knew this was true. They had all seen it happen. Friends had died following doctrine precisely, exactly, and fatally. They asked Aruth to show them his methods. Aruth explained the underlying geometry, the closure rates, the attack disruption principle, the suppressive fire concept, ammunition management techniques, threat categorization systems, and calculated appropriate responses. They listened carefully and understood the logic. They asked practical questions about implementation. How early do you actually fire? 600, 700, 800 yards, depending on the specific threat assessment. That's very far. Yes, but it's demonstrably effective. What about ammunition consumption? You manage it very carefully. You categorize each threat quickly. You respond appropriately to each situation. They asked for examples. Aruth explained his 3 threat categories in detail. Dangerous, experienced pilots received heavy fire early to eliminate the threat completely. Average pilots received medium fire to conserve ammunition while still disrupting. Inexperienced pilots received warning fire to intimidate and conserve maximum ammunition. It made complete logical sense. It was tactical. It was scientific. It was survival mathematics. They asked if they should try it on the next combat mission. Aruth replied it was completely their choice and their life. They decided they would try it on the very next mission to evaluate the results personally. If it worked, they would continue using it. If it didn't work, they would return to standard doctrine. It was a simple scientific test. Hypothesis, test, results, conclusion. This is exactly how knowledge spreads in wartime. One person teaching one lesson to one student at a time, multiplying gradually, growing steadily. Spreading quietly until eventually the doctrine changes, until everyone knows the truth, until survival rates improve measurably, until the war changes fundamentally. This was a small beginning with potentially large impact. This was Aruth as teacher, tactician, and survivor, changing the war one gunner at a time, one mission at a time, one lesson at a time, one survival at a time. On July 24th, a mission targeted Warnemünde, a naval shipyard on the Baltic coast. It was a long flight with heavy opposition expected. 3 gunners who had learned from Aruth, Jenkins, Martinez, and Williams were all trying his tactics for the first time. They were all nervous, all determined, and all desperately hoping to survive. Jenkins was attacked from 6 o'clock high by 4 Focke-Wulfs in formation. He fired at 700 yards early and aggressively with a long burst. The fighters saw the tracers streaming toward them and broke formation immediately. The attack was completely disrupted. Some fighters aborted entirely. Jenkins survived completely uninjured. The new tactic worked perfectly. Martinez was attacked from 6 o'clock level by 2 Messerschmitts with experienced pilots in good formation. He fired at 800 yards very early. Tracers streamed and connected. One fighter started smoking. The formation broke apart. The attack was prevented. Martinez survived uninjured. The tactic worked. Williams was attacked from 6 o'clock low by 3 fighters in sloppy formation with obviously inexperienced pilots. He fired at 400 yards with warning fire in a short burst of only 30 rounds, carefully conserving ammunition. The fighters were intimidated and broke away immediately. Williams survived uninjured with ammunition well conserved. The tactic worked perfectly. All 3 men survived their first mission using Aruth's tactics. All were successful. All were completely convinced. All would continue using these methods. Word spread faster now through the squadron. 4 gunners became 7, then 10, then more throughout the unit. The squadron leadership noticed. The group command noticed. Results were speaking louder than regulations. Aruth's aircraft had 0 casualties. Now others also had 0 casualties. There was a definite pattern. There was clear evidence. There was proof. The standard doctrine was wrong. The new tactics were right. The question remained whether higher command would officially notice, whether the doctrine would be formally changed, and whether everyone would eventually adopt these proven tactics or continue dying needlessly, preventably, and stupidly. Time would tell the final answer. On July 26th, Aruth was summoned to squadron operations to meet with Major Collins, the squadron commander, and a highly experienced combat veteran who was known for being practical and results-oriented. Major Collins stated he had heard about Aruth's tactics of firing early. He asked Aruth to explain the reasoning. Aruth explained once again about early fire, attack disruption, suppression, and improved survival. Collins listened very carefully, thinking and calculating as a commander must. He had responsibility for unit survival, mission success, and doctrine adherence. It was a difficult balance. Collins noted that the doctrine said to wait until 300 yards. Aruth confirmed this was correct. Collins stated that Aruth was firing at 600, 700, 800 yards instead. Aruth confirmed. Collins asked why Aruth was disobeying standing orders. Aruth explained he wasn't disobeying, but rather adapting to survive. Collins pointed out that others were dying while following doctrine. Aruth confirmed that yes, some were. Collins noted that Aruth's aircraft had 0 casualties in 12 missions. Aruth confirmed. Collins observed that others were adopting Aruth's tactics and also surviving. Aruth confirmed 4 others were. There was a long, meaningful pause. Collins was thinking carefully. The evidence was absolutely clear. Aruth was alive. Others copying him were alive. Doctrine followers were dying. It was simple, but there were seriously complicating factors. Headquarters had established the doctrine officially. It had been supposedly tested. Change required formal authority, official approval, extensive documentation, and military bureaucracy. But men were dying right now, today. He couldn't wait for bureaucracy to slowly grind through approvals. Collins made his command decision. He told Aruth to continue his tactics. He should teach others, but informally and quietly, not officially, not yet. He asked if Aruth understood. Aruth confirmed he understood completely. Collins stated that results spoke for themselves. Aruth should keep producing positive results. Aruth confirmed he would. Collins dismissed him. Aruth left, feeling relieved. He wasn't being punished for deviation. He was being implicitly approved. Major Collins was recognizing combat reality. The doctrine was demonstrably failing. New tactics were clearly working. It was a practical decision. It was a command decision. It was a survival decision. This was the beginning of official recognition, unofficial approval, doctrine change, starting small and slow, but definitely starting to happen. Change was coming. July 30th, 1943 would prove to be the day that validated or destroyed everything Michael Aruth believed about aerial gunnery. The day began in darkness at 0430 hours when the charge of quarters walked through the barracks with a flashlight, quietly waking the crews scheduled for the morning mission. The wake-up was always whisper quiet, almost reverent, as if speaking too loudly might invite bad luck or attract death's attention. Superstition ran deep among bomber crews. Every man had his rituals, his lucky charms, his private prayers. Aruth woke immediately from light sleep. He never slept deeply before missions. His mind wouldn't allow it. He lay in his bunk for 30 seconds, orienting himself, remembering where he was and what day it was. Then he swung his legs out and began dressing in the dim light. Around him, other men were doing the same in near silence. Flight suits, boots, jackets, the uniform of men about to fly into combat. The barracks were cold, despite the English summer. Everything in England was damp and cold and gray. Aruth pulled on his flight suit slowly, methodically, checking each zipper and fastener. Attention to detail mattered. A loose connection on the heated suit could mean frostbite at altitude. Frostbite could mean amputation. Amputation could mean death if it happened at the wrong moment in combat. Everything connected, everything mattered. By 0445, the crews were shuffling toward the mess hall through pre-dawn darkness. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, but true sunrise was still an hour away. The air smelled of aviation fuel, cut grass, and the distinctive coal smoke that always hung over English air bases. Somewhere in the distance, ground crews were already working on aircraft, running final checks, loading ammunition and bombs. The mess hall was brightly lit and warm, almost painfully bright after the darkness outside. The cooks had prepared a special mission breakfast, which meant real eggs instead of powdered, actual bacon instead of mystery meat, fresh toast with butter. This was the privilege and the curse of Mission Day. Good food because you might die. Good food because many wouldn't return to eat again. Aruth ate mechanically, fueling his body without tasting much. His stomach was tight with pre-mission tension, which was normal and expected. 12 missions hadn't eliminated the fear. They'd only taught him to function despite it. Around him, other crews ate in relative quiet. Some men joked nervously, others ate in grim silence. A few pushed food around their plates without eating, stomachs too knotted to accept fuel. At 0500 hours exactly, the crews began moving toward the briefing room. This was a large Quonset hut with rows of wooden benches facing a raised platform. A large map of Europe covered the wall behind the platform, currently hidden behind a curtain. That curtain concealed the day's target, the day's mission, the day's probable death toll. The room filled quickly. Pilots and co-pilots sat in front, navigators and bombardiers behind them. Engineers, radio operators, and gunners filled the remaining rows. Aruth took his customary seat in the back row. The tail gunner position was isolated in flight, and he preferred isolation on the ground as well. It gave him space to think. At 0500 hours exactly, the briefing officer entered, followed by the group commander, the operations officer, and the intelligence officer. Everyone stood briefly at attention, then sat. The briefing officer stepped to the platform. Without preamble, he pulled the curtain aside. The red line stretched deep into Germany, very deep. From England across the Channel, across Belgium, across the German border, and deep into central Germany. The target city name was visible even from the back row, Kassel. The room erupted in groans and muttered curses. Kassel was deep, over 250 miles into enemy territory. This meant long exposure to fighters, heavy flak, and high casualties. The intelligence officer stepped forward and began speaking. Today's target was Kassel, specifically the Fieseler aircraft factory and Focke-Wulf assembly plant. These facilities were producing approximately 600 FW-190 fighters per month. Strategic importance was rated as extreme. The factories had to be destroyed or at least heavily damaged to reduce German fighter production and achieve air superiority over Europe. The route was displayed clearly. Takeoff at 0800 hours. Assembly over Kimolton. Join the 91st Bomb Group to form a complete combat wing. Proceed to the Channel and cross at Dover. Enter Belgian airspace and turn southeast toward Germany. Penetrate 250 miles to the initial point, 15 miles north of Kassel. Bombing run heading south. Target approach from 11 degrees. Winds aloft were 20 knots from the west. Bombing altitude would be 25,000 feet. Expected time over target was 12:45 hours. Then came the difficult part. Fighter escort would be provided by P-47 Thunderbolts from the 91st Fighter Group. However, fuel limitations required the escorts to turn back at the German border. Estimated departure point was Belgian airspace at approximately 11:15 hours. From that point forward, the bombers would be completely unescorted for approximately 200 miles of penetration, the bomb run, and the initial phase of return. Intelligence indicated approximately 300 Luftwaffe fighters based at surrounding airfields. Continuous attacks were expected from the German border to Kassel and back to the Channel on return. This was stated matter-of-factly, as if describing weather conditions rather than a gauntlet of death. The briefing officer continued with flak information. Kassel was heavily defended with 12 batteries of 88mm guns confirmed. 72 individual guns total, arranged in a ring defense with 5-mile radius. Target approach was unavoidable through this flak concentration. Accurate fire was expected, concentrated fire was expected, deadly fire was expected. The recommended procedure was to maintain tight formation for mutual defensive support. Translation: they couldn't avoid the flak, they had to fly straight through it, and they should accept the casualties. Weather forecast was delivered next. English Channel would be clear. Belgium would have scattered clouds at 8,000 feet. Germany would be clear with unlimited visibility. Target area conditions were excellent for bombing. Return forecast was similar, with some cloud cover developing late afternoon over the Channel that might provide some concealment. Translation: Perfect weather for bombing also meant perfect weather for German fighters to see everything and attack everything. Expected losses were stated clinically, based on intelligence estimates and previous missions of similar penetration depth. Expected losses were calculated at 10%. 18 aircraft, 180 crew members, today. This was presented as simple statistics, cold mathematical probability. Some crews would not return. The question was, which crews? Unknown. Everyone hoped it would be someone else. Everyone knew it might be them. The briefing concluded at 05:30 hours. The crews filed out silently, processing what they'd just heard. Deep penetration. No escort for 200 miles. 300 enemy fighters. Heavy flak. 10% losses expected. 18 bombers gone. 180 men dead, captured, or missing. These were the facts. This was the mission. This was war. Aruth walked slowly back to his barracks to collect his personal flight equipment. He moved methodically through his pre-flight checklist. Heated flight suit with all electrical connections checked and tested. Parachute harness adjusted and fitted properly. May West life vest, though it seemed almost pointless over Germany where water was scarce. Oxygen mask tested for proper seal. Helmet with integrated headphones for intercom communication. Heavy gloves rated for extreme cold. Survival kit with compass, maps, and emergency supplies. Personal sidearm, the Colt 1911 .45 caliber pistol with one magazine of 7 rounds plus 1 in the chamber. 8 rounds total for escape and evasion or final desperate defense. By 06:15, the crews were gathering at the aircraft hardstands. Ground crews had been working through the night. Final checks were complete. Engines had been pre-flight tested. Ammunition was loaded. Bombs were secured in the bay. Fuel tanks were full. The aircraft were ready. The question was whether the crews were ready, but that question didn't really matter because, ready or not, the mission would proceed. Tandlio sat on her hardstand, looking massive and deadly in the early morning light. B-17F Flying Fortress, 4 Wright Cyclone R-1820 engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower. Total 4,800 horsepower. Maximum speed 287 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. Service ceiling 37,000 feet. Range 2,000 miles with standard fuel load. Crew complement 10 men. Defensive armament 1350 caliber machine guns. Bomb load 4,800 pounds. Total weight approximately 65,000 pounds when fully loaded. The aircraft was formidable, powerful, and deadly, but also vulnerable in ways that mattered. The construction was aluminum, thin and light and fast, but not armored except in critical areas. Bullets penetrated easily. Cannon shells destroyed easily. Fire killed easily. The aircraft was strong, but the crew was fragile. Life depended on tactics, skill, and substantial luck. The crew gathered near the nose for the traditional pre-flight crew photograph. This was another ritual, another superstition. Smile for the camera. Pretend confidence. Create a memory in case some or all don't return. The photographer snapped several shots quickly. The crew broke apart and began boarding. Lieutenant Bendener and co-pilot Bill Scott climbed up through the nose hatch into the cockpit. Navigator Murphy and Bombardier followed, taking their positions in the nose. Flight engineer climbed to his station in the top turret. Radio operator Frank Walls moved to the radio compartment. Waist gunners. Tom Martin and Joe Hansen went to their positions on opposite sides of the fuselage. Ball turret gunner Willie Edson climbed into his cramped and terrible position beneath the aircraft. Aruth was always last to board. The tail gunner position required crawling through the entire length of the fuselage from nose to tail, navigating through the narrow tunnel past ammunition boxes, oxygen bottles, equipment racks, and structural members. It was 40 feet from the waist to the tail, and every inch was cramped and difficult. He crawled carefully, dragging his parachute pack and equipment bag. The fuselage was dim despite the morning light outside. Small windows provided minimal illumination. He moved by feel as much as sight, knowing the route from 12 previous missions, past the ball turret mechanism, past the tail wheel housing, into the tail section itself. The tail gunner position was exactly as he'd left it after the previous mission. 4 feet wide, 5 feet long, the bicycle seat mounted in the center. The two Browning M250 caliber machine guns pointing backward through the curved plexiglass window. Ammunition boxes secured to both sides. Oxygen hose connection. Intercom connection. Heated suit power connection. Aruth settled onto the bicycle seat and began his station checks. Both guns traverse freely. Elevation and depression mechanisms functional. Ammunition belts properly fed. 800 rounds per gun, 1,600 rounds total. Gun sight aligned and clear. Plexiglass window clean and unscratched. Oxygen flowing properly at test pressure. Intercom functional with clear communication. Heated suit power connected and warming. Everything checked, everything ready, everything functional. At 0730, the engines began starting. Number 3 engine first, the inboard right engine. The propeller turned slowly, coughed, caught, and roared to life with a distinctive radial engine sound. Number 4 followed, the outboard right. Then numbers 1 and 2 on the left wing. All 4 engines running smoothly, props spinning in perfect circles, the entire aircraft shaking and vibrating with contained power. At 0745, the control tower fired a green flare into the morning sky, the signal to begin taxiing. Across the airfield, 18 B-17s began moving almost simultaneously, a parade of elephants, slow and ponderous and powerful. Tandleo released brakes and began rolling forward from the hardstand toward the taxiway. The taxi to the runway took 15 minutes, the aircraft moving in careful sequence to avoid collisions and maintain proper spacing. Ground crews stood along the taxiway, watching and waving. "Good luck. Come back. Kill Germans. Be safe." The crews waved back through the windows. "Thanks. We'll try. See you later. Maybe." At 0800 hours precisely, the first B-17 reached the runway threshold and aligned for takeoff. The pilot ran the engines up to full power. The noise was overwhelming even at a distance. The aircraft shook against the brakes, straining forward. Then the brakes released, and the bomber rolled forward, accelerating slowly under its tremendous weight. 60,000 pounds of aircraft, fuel, bombs, ammunition, and crew. The tail came up. Speed increased. 80 miles per hour, 90, 100. The wheels lifted clear of the runway, and the aircraft climbed away gradually, banking right into the circuit pattern. The second aircraft followed 30 seconds later, then the third, then the fourth. Tandleo was number 5 in the takeoff sequence. Bendiner taxied onto the runway and aligned carefully. He ran up the engines, checking magnetos, propeller pitch, and power output. Everything checked good. He released the brakes. The aircraft surged forward, accelerating down the concrete runway. Aruth felt the tail come up as speed increased. Through his small window, he watched the runway fall away behind them as the wheels lifted off. They were airborne. They were committed. The mission had begun. The formation assembly was a complex aerial ballet that took 90 minutes to complete properly. Each squadron climbed to its assigned altitude and circled its designated assembly point. Aircraft joined their squadrons one by one. Squadrons joined groups. Groups joined wings. Slowly, deliberately, the massive formation took shape over England. High squadron, lead squadron, low squadron, each in precise position relative to the others. By 0930, the formation was complete. 180 B-17 flying fortresses in tight combat box formation. The defensive formation was three-dimensional, with aircraft stacked vertically and spread horizontally to provide interlocking fields of defensive fire. In theory, this provided mutual protection where every bomber's guns could support its neighbors. In theory, attacking fighters would face defensive fire from dozens of guns simultaneously. In theory, this made the formation nearly impregnable. Reality would prove significantly different from theory, as reality always did in combat. At 0930, the lead bomber turned east toward the channel. The massive formation followed, adjusting, tucking in tighter, closing intervals to 200 feet between aircraft. This was dangerously close, risking mid-air collision, but necessary for maximum defensive effectiveness. The formation stretched 3 miles in length, 2 miles in width, and 1,000 feet in vertical depth. It was a massive aerial armada, unprecedented in size and power. The P-47 Thunderbolt fighters appeared right on schedule at 0940, 123 Escort fighters from the 91st Fighter Group taking position around the bomber stream. Above, below, and to the sides, the little friends, the guardian angels. Their presence was enormously comforting, knowing friendly fighters were protecting the formation. But everyone also knew the arithmetic. The Thunderbolts carried fuel for approximately 90 minutes of combat operations. The mission to Kassel would require 6 hours from takeoff to landing. For most of the mission, the bombers would fly completely alone and unprotected. At 1000 hours, the formation crossed the English coastline and headed out over the channel. Aruth watched England recede through his tail window. The white cliffs of Dover were clearly visible, bright and distinctive against the dark water and green land. The cliffs were symbolic, the last friendly territory, the last safe ground. Ahead lay enemy territory, danger and death. Behind lay England, home, safety, and survival. The distance between them was only 21 miles of cold water, but the psychological distance was infinite. The channel crossing took only 6 minutes at the formation's speed, but it felt much longer. Every man was thinking, processing, preparing mentally for combat. Some prayed, some checked equipment obsessively, some stared into space, lost in thought. Everyone dealt with fear differently, but everyone felt it. Fear was normal. Fear was expected. Fear kept you alert and careful. The absence of fear meant you didn't understand the danger or you'd already accepted death. France appeared ahead, the coast of occupied France controlled by Germany for over 3 years since the invasion of June 1940. The land looked peaceful and pastoral from altitude, green fields, forests, rivers, villages. It was anything but peaceful. Germans patrolled everywhere. Anti-aircraft guns waited. Radar stations tracked every aircraft. Fighter bases held hundreds of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs ready to launch. The peaceful appearance was utterly deceptive. The formation crossed the French coast at 10:06. They were now in enemy airspace, subject to attack at any moment. The formation tightened further, aircraft closing to within 150 feet of each other. Pilots concentrated intensely on maintaining exact position. A momentary loss of focus could cause a collision, killing 20 men instantly in 2 aircraft. Light flak began almost immediately, black puffs of smoke bursting at their altitude. These were 88mm shells, the German weapon that dominated European skies. Each shell exploded with tremendous force, throwing thousands of metal fragments in all directions. A direct hit would destroy any bomber instantly. A near miss could cause catastrophic damage. Even a distant burst could pierce fuel tanks, sever control cables, or wound crew members. The flak wasn't particularly accurate at this distance from the German border, but it was frightening regardless. Each burst made a distinctive cracking sound and created a shock wave that physically shook nearby aircraft. Aruth watched the black puffs appear and disappear, trying to discern patterns, looking for concentration areas that might indicate the formation's path was predicted. The flak was random so far, searching, probing, adjusting. At 10:30, the formation crossed into Belgian airspace. Belgium had been occupied since May 1940, conquered in 18 days during the German Blitzkrieg. The Belgians had fought courageously but hopelessly against overwhelming German strength. Now, Belgium served as occupied territory, strategic ground between Germany and France, critical for transportation and logistics. The flak intensified over Belgium. More batteries, more guns, more shells. The sky filled with black bursts. The formation flew straight through, unable to maneuver, unable to evade, accepting whatever damage came. This was strategic bombing doctrine. Maintain formation, accept casualties, complete the mission. The doctrine was ruthless and mathematical and absolutely necessary for victory. At 1100 hours, the P-47 escorts began performing aerobatics, rolling and waggling their wings. This was the signal. They were at maximum range. They had to turn back or run out of fuel and crash. The bomber crews watched the fighters turn west toward England and safety and life. The bombers continued east toward Germany and danger and death. The separation felt profound and immediate. With the fighters present, there was psychological comfort even if their tactical effectiveness was limited. Without the fighters, the bombers were alone and exposed and vulnerable. The formation tightened even more, seeking safety in proximity, seeking protection in numbers. At 11:15 exactly, the last thunderbolt departed. The bombers were alone. Ahead lay 140 miles of German airspace before reaching Kassel. Behind lay the same distance back to safety. 280 miles total of unescorted flight through the most heavily defended airspace in the world. 300 German fighters were waiting, coordinating, planning. The intercom came alive with crew reports. Top turret reported fighters visible in the distance. Waist positions confirmed sightings. Ball turret saw aircraft approaching from below. The Luftwaffe was gathering, massing, preparing to attack in coordinated waves designed to overwhelm defenses and shatter formations. Aruth scanned his sector constantly through the plexiglass canopy. 6 o'clock position, directly astern, his responsibility, his domain, his battlefield. The sky behind the formation was empty so far, just blue sky and scattered clouds. But that would change soon, very soon. The fighters always attacked from behind. The tail position always engaged first. The tail gunner always died first if things went wrong. At 11:30, the first visual contact. Multiple aircraft climbing from the southeast in groups of 4. Aruth counted carefully. 8 fighters, 12 fighters, 16, 20. More climbing to altitude beyond those. The sky was filling with hostile aircraft, black crosses on yellow noses, Luftwaffe fighters gathering for the attack. The intercom exploded with position calls. Fighters 12 o'clock high, fighters 3 o'clock level, fighters 9 o'clock low, fighters everywhere. The gunners called out bearings, ranges, numbers, everyone preparing, everyone ready, everyone knowing that in moments the sky would fill with tracers and cannon shells and death. Aruth tracked the fighters approaching from 6 o'clock. They were climbing in a defensive formation, preparing to attack from altitude where they had advantage. Experienced pilots, veteran units. This was clear from their formation discipline and approach angles. They weren't rushing in. They were setting up properly, taking time to position correctly, preparing for a coordinated attack that would be difficult to defend. At 11:42, the first fighters began their attack runs. 4 Messerschmitt Bf-109s from 6 o'clock high, diving toward the formation at over 400 miles per hour. Classic Luftwaffe tactics, high-speed approach, minimal exposure time, maximum impact. They came in tight formation, experienced pilots working together, covering each other, supporting each other. Aruth tracked the lead fighter through his gun sight. The range was 800 yards and closing fast. The closure rate was tremendous, both aircraft moving toward each other at combined speeds approaching 600 miles per hour. In 10 seconds, they would pass each other. In 10 seconds, one or both might be dead. The doctrine said to wait. Wait until 300 yards. Fire short bursts. Conserve ammunition. Be precise. Aruth ignored every word of it. He had tested his theory over 12 missions. He had proven his approach worked. He had taught others successfully. Today would be the ultimate test. Today would prove whether his calculations were correct or fatally wrong. At 800 yards, Aruth squeezed both triggers. The twin Browning M2s erupted with their distinctive heavy thumping sound. 800 rounds per minute combined, approximately 13 rounds per second, both guns firing continuously. The recoil was substantial but manageable. The noise was overwhelming. The gun barrels began glowing faintly from the heat. The tracers arced outward, bright points of light streaming away at 2,900 feet per second. Every fifth round was a tracer, burning brightly so the gunner could see his aim and adjust. 4 normal rounds, 1 tracer, 4 normal, 1 tracer, the pattern continuous and mesmerizing and deadly. At 800 yards, the tracers fell short of the approaching fighters. This was expected. Physics and ballistics. The bullets were dropping due to gravity, but Aruth wasn't trying to hit them at 800 yards. He was adjusting, walking the fire toward them, forcing them to react. At 700 yards, the tracers began reaching the target area. Bright streaks passing near the lead fighter. Not hitting yet, but close. Very close. Close enough that the German pilot could see them clearly through his canopy. Close enough that he had to make a decision: continue the attack and accept the defensive fire, or break early and abort. At 600 yards, the tracers started connecting. Bright flashes appeared on the lead fighter's engine, cowling, and wing roots. Aruth was hitting him, repeatedly, accurately, devastatingly. The 50 caliber rounds were destroying the aircraft piece by piece in real time. The lead fighter began smoking. White smoke first, which meant coolant leaking. Then black smoke, which meant oil burning. Then the fighter broke hard right, rolling away from the formation, trailing heavy smoke and losing altitude. 1 fighter down, 1 threat eliminated. The other 3 fighters in the formation saw their leader go down. They saw the aggressive defensive fire. They saw the tracer stream that had destroyed their comrade. They made instant calculations: risk versus reward, glory versus survival. They broke formation early, scattering, aborting their attack runs before reaching effective cannon range. All 3 dived away, seeking safety in the clouds below. Aruth released the triggers. The sudden silence was almost shocking after the continuous roar of fire. His ears were ringing despite the leather helmet. The gun barrels glowed visibly red from sustained fire. Smoke drifted in the tail compartment from the guns. The first attack was over. Approximately 20 seconds from initiation to conclusion. 100 rounds expended. One enemy fighter destroyed, 3 more driven off, the formation undamaged, Tandleo untouched, Aruth uninjured. But the sky behind the formation was filled with more fighters, dozens more, hundreds more. They were circling, positioning, preparing for the next attack wave. This was only the beginning. The real fight hadn't even started yet. The next 6 hours would determine everything: survival or death, victory or defeat, life or eternal darkness. Aruth reloaded his mental calculations. 100 rounds expended from 1,600 total, 1,500 rounds remaining, approximately 30 more attacks expected before reaching England, 50 rounds average per engagement. Mathematics still favorable, but barely. Every round had to count. Every burst had to be effective. Every decision had to be perfect. The intercom crackled with reports from other positions. Top turret engaged fighters from 12 o'clock high. Waist guns firing at 3 o'clock level. Ball turret tracking fighters below. Everyone fighting, everyone shooting, everyone trying to survive. At 11:50, the second attack wave came. 6 fighters from 6 o'clock level, approaching in a line astern formation. This was different from the first attack, less coordinated but more persistent. These pilots were determined, aggressive, willing to press their attacks despite defensive fire. Aruth fired at 700 yards. Long burst, 60 rounds. The tracers streamed out, walking onto target, hitting the lead fighter repeatedly. The fighter kept coming despite the hits, pilot determined or suicidal or both. Aruth kept firing, continuous trigger pressure, rounds pouring into the attacking aircraft. At 500 yards, the fighter finally broke, wing on fire, spiraling downward. But the second fighter was already there, pressing the attack, firing his cannons. Boom, boom, boom. The distinctive sound of 20mm cannons firing. 3 shells passed close to Tandleo, 1 passing through the formation between aircraft with only feet to spare. Aruth swung his guns toward the second fighter and fired. The tracers connected immediately. The fighter exploded, not a gradual fire, but instant catastrophic destruction. The cannon shells, or fuel, or ammunition, or all 3 detonating simultaneously. One moment a fighter aircraft, next moment a cloud of debris. The remaining 4 fighters scattered, breaking off their attacks early. 2 fighters down in 30 seconds. The Luftwaffe pilots were learning that this particular bomber, this particular tail gunner, was extremely dangerous. Word was spreading. Avoid that aircraft. Easier targets exist elsewhere. Survival matters more than one bomber. But the attacks kept coming. 3rd wave, 4th wave, 5th wave. The sky filled with fighters, attacking from all angles, coordination breaking down into individual attacks and opportunistic firing. The defensive guns poured out thousands of rounds. The bomber formation was a flying fortress in truth, bristling with weapons, spitting fire in all directions. Aruth fired repeatedly, burst after burst, engagement after engagement. His ammunition counter spun downward steadily. 1,500 rounds, 1,400, 1,300, 1,200. Every burst depleted the supply. Every attack consumed precious ammunition. The mathematics was becoming concerning. At 12:15, 33 minutes into the fighter attacks, Aruth's left gun suddenly stopped firing. The bolt locked back. The gun was silent. He checked the ammunition feed. The belt was moving properly. He checked the mechanism. Everything appeared functional. He tried to fire again. Nothing. The gun was jammed, seized by some mechanical failure, combat damage, or heat stress. The barrel was glowing bright red from sustained fire, visibly hot even in daylight. 1 gun down, 1 gun remaining. 800 rounds in the working gun. 90 minutes of flying time remaining before reaching England. Approximately 20 more attacks expected. 800 divided by 20 equals 40 rounds per engagement. Still possible, but margin for error was gone. Every round was critical. Every shot was vital. Every decision was life or death. The formation reached the initial point at 012:30, 15 miles north of Kassel. The bombers turned south, beginning the bombing run. For the next 11 minutes, they would fly straight and level, unable to maneuver, unable to evade. The bombardiers needed stable platforms to aim the Norden bomb sites. The bombing run was the most vulnerable phase of every mission. The fighters knew this. They pressed their attacks with renewed fury. Aruth fired conservatively now, short controlled bursts, precise aim, ammunition conservation critical. He categorized each threat quickly. Category 1, threats received immediate heavy fire. Category 2 received moderate fire. Category 3 received minimal warning fire. Every round had to count. Every burst had to be effective. At 012:35, a Focke-Wulf 190 attacked from 5 o'clock position slightly off the direct 6 o'clock approach. This was dangerous because it was partially in Aruth's blind spot, difficult to track, difficult to engage. The fighter was aggressive, experienced, determined. He fired his cannons early, shells streaming toward Tandlio. Aruth traversed his remaining gun to maximum angle, tracking the fighter, waiting for the optimal moment. The fighter kept coming, committed, cannon shells getting closer. At 400 yards, Aruth fired. Short burst. 15 rounds. The tracers connected. The fighter's canopy shattered. The pilot slumped forward. The aircraft rolled inverted and dove straight down, pilot dead or unconscious, aircraft doomed. Aruth released the triggers immediately, conserving ammunition. 785 rounds remaining. One gun, approximately 45 minutes to target. Then the return journey, then England, then safety, then survival, maybe, hopefully. Statistically unlikely, but still possible. The bombing run continued. The fighters attacked continuously. The defensive guns fired constantly. The sky was chaos. Tracers everywhere, fighters diving and climbing, bombers steady and determined. This was strategic bombing. This was total war. This was the price of victory measured in blood and fire, and young men dying in foreign skies, far from home. At 012:45, the bombardier called bombs away over the intercom. The aircraft lurched upward as 4,800 pounds of high explosive dropped free. The bombs fell toward Kassel 5 miles below, toward the factories and workers and buildings and Germans. 40 seconds to impact. Terminal velocity, physics, death falling from the sky. The formation turned west immediately, heading home, heading toward England, heading toward safety. But they weren't safe yet. 200 miles of enemy territory remained. Hundreds of German fighters remained. Dozens of flak batteries remained. The fight was far from over. In many ways, it was only beginning. The return journey through the same gauntlet would test everything Aruth had learned, everything he believed, everything he had proven. His ammunition status was critical. 785 rounds remaining, one gun functional, 200 miles to fly, perhaps 20 more attacks expected. Mathematics was barely possible. Survival was barely probable. But Michael Aruth had calculated the odds before and beaten them. He would calculate again. He would fight again. He would survive again. Or he would die trying. Either way, he would prove his theory correct or die proving it wrong. There was no middle ground, no compromise, no retreat, only forward, only fight, only survive. The return journey began at 012:51 hours when the formation completed its turn west and headed away from Kassel. Behind them, the city burned under columns of black smoke rising thousands of feet into the clear German sky. The factories were hit, production was damaged, the mission was accomplished. But the cost was already severe. 20 bombers had gone down over the target, 200 men gone forever. The formation that turned west numbered only 160 aircraft instead of the 180 that had crossed into Germany that morning. Aruth watched the reduced formation through his tail window, counting aircraft, noting gaps where bombers should be but weren't. Each gap represented 10 men, 20 men, 30 men, friends, acquaintances, strangers who had eaten breakfast at the same mess hall, attended the same briefing, shared the same fear. Now they were gone, dead or captured or falling through the sky, hoping their parachutes would open. But there was no time for contemplation or grief. The Luftwaffe was regrouping, refueling, rearming. Fresh fighters were launching from airfields all across Germany. The bombers were heading west toward Belgium and France and the Channel and England. The fighters were positioning to intercept, to attack, to kill. The gauntlet was far from over. Aruth's situation was becoming increasingly desperate, one gun remaining functional. 785 rounds of ammunition, 190 miles to England, perhaps 20 more fighter attacks expected based on the inbound experience. The mathematics were barely possible. 39 rounds per engagement average. That was insufficient for suppressive fire, but adequate for warning fire and selective engagement. He would have to be perfect. Every burst would have to count. Every decision would have to be correct. There was zero margin for error. At 0:12:55, the first return attack developed. 2 Messerschmitt Bf-109s from 6 o'clock level, approaching steadily in loose formation. The pilots looked tired even from a distance. Their approach was less aggressive than earlier attacks. They were probably low on fuel, low on ammunition, near the end of their mission endurance. But they were still deadly, still dangerous, still capable of killing. Aruth tracked them through his gun sight, one eye closed, focusing on the lead aircraft. He categorized them quickly. Category 2, threat. Experienced enough, but not elite. Tired, cautious. He would fire at medium range with a moderate burst, not trying to kill necessarily, but to disrupt and warn. At 500 yards, Aruth fired. 12 rounds. Short, controlled burst. The tracers streamed out and connected almost immediately on the lead fighter's wing. Sparks flew, metal tore. The pilot reacted instantly, braking hard left, aborting his attack. The wingman followed automatically. Both fighters dove away seeking safety. 773 rounds remaining. 2 fighters driven off. Ammunition conservation successful. Aruth breathed slowly, deliberately, forcing his heart rate down. The adrenaline was constant now, a chemical tide that heightened awareness, but also caused fatigue and trembling hands. He had to stay calm, had to stay focused, had to stay alive. The formation crossed from German airspace into Belgian airspace at 0:13:15 hours. This was psychologically significant, though tactically meaningless. Belgium was still occupied territory, still controlled by Germany, still hostile. But it felt different somehow. Closer to safety, closer to England, closer to survival. Every mile west was 1 mile closer to living. Belgian flak began immediately. The 88mm batteries opened fire from their concealed positions around industrial cities and transportation hubs. The black puffs filled the sky at their altitude. Each burst made a distinctive cracking sound and created visible shock waves that rippled through the air. The formation flew straight through, maintaining discipline, accepting whatever damage came. 3 bombers were hit by flak within 5 minutes. The first took a direct hit in the number 3 engine. The engine exploded, propeller flying off, wing catching fire. The crew fought to control the aircraft, but the fire spread too quickly. 7 parachutes emerged before the bomber rolled inverted and dove straight down. 3 men didn't get out. The aircraft exploded on impact far below. The second bomber suffered a less dramatic but equally fatal hit. A flak shell penetrated the cockpit and exploded, killing both pilots instantly. The aircraft flew straight for perhaps 10 seconds, then the nose dropped and it began a long, slow spiral downward. No one emerged. The entire crew rode it down, either dead or unable to reach the exits, until it crashed into a Belgian forest. The third bomber was hit in the bomb bay, where residual fuel vapors lingered despite the bombs being gone. The shell detonated these vapors, creating a massive internal explosion that broke the aircraft in half. The tail section separated completely and tumbled away. Both pieces fell separately. No parachutes. 10 men gone in an instant. Aruth watched this carnage through his window, unable to help, unable to prevent it, unable to do anything except witness and survive. Flak couldn't be fought with machine guns. Flak couldn't be dodged at bombing altitude. Flak could only be endured with hope and luck and prayer that the next shell wouldn't have your name on it. The flak continued for another 12 minutes as they crossed Belgium. Then it diminished and finally stopped as they moved beyond the range of German batteries. The immediate threat was over, but the cost had been severe. 3 more bombers gone, 30 more men. The formation was now down to 157 aircraft from the original 180. 23 bombers lost, 230 men. The attrition rate was climbing toward 15%, significantly higher than the 10% predicted at briefing. At 1331, more fighters appeared. 4 Focke-Wulf 19s from 6 o'clock high, diving fast. Aruth tracked them through his gun sight, assessing quickly. Category 1 threat. Aggressive approach. High speed, tight formation, experienced pilots. This was maximum danger. He fired at 800 yards immediately. Long burst, 40 rounds, heavy suppressive fire. The tracers reached out like bright fingers, searching for the targets. At 700 yards, they began connecting. The lead fighter took multiple hits on the engine cowling and wings. Sparks flew, metal shredded. But the fighter kept coming, committed to the attack. Aruth kept his finger on the trigger, continuous fire, pouring rounds into the approaching fighter. 50 rounds, 60 rounds, 70. The gun barrel was glowing bright red, almost white-hot. Smoke poured from the weapon. But the tracers kept streaming out, kept hitting, kept destroying. At 600 yards, the lead fighter's engine seized completely. The propeller stopped turning. Black smoke poured from the cowling. The fighter rolled inverted and dove straight down, pilot still in the cockpit, either dead or unable to bail out. The other 3 fighters saw this and broke formation immediately, scattering, aborting, diving away to safety. 703 rounds remaining. 1 confirmed kill. 3 more driven off. But the cost had been high. 70 rounds expended in a single engagement. The mathematics were becoming increasingly desperate. The intercom crackled. Bendiner's voice, strained and concerned. He was asking about the tail position status. Aruth responded that he was operational but wounded. Bendiner asked how badly. Aruth replied fragments in the left side, but bleeding was controlled and he could continue. Bendiner asked about ammunition. Aruth reported 700 rounds remaining in 1 gun only. There was a long pause. 700 rounds. Approximately 170 miles remaining to England. 20 potential attacks. Mathematics didn't look favorable. Bendiner asked if Aruth could continue fighting. Aruth confirmed he could and would continue until reaching England or dying, whichever came first. Bendiner acknowledged this and told him to keep fighting. The conversation ended, but it was significant. The pilot knew Aruth was wounded and low on ammunition. The pilot knew survival was questionable. But the pilot trusted Aruth to continue, to fight, to protect the aircraft and crew for as long as possible. At 13:45, another attack developed from 6 o'clock low. 3 fighters in loose formation. Category 2, threat, moderate danger. Aruth fired at 400 yards with a short burst of 20 rounds. The tracers connected on the lead fighter's underside. The pilot flinched and broke away immediately. The others followed. 3 fighters driven off with minimal ammunition expenditure, 683 rounds remaining. The conservation was working, but barely. Every engagement depleted the supply. Every burst brought him closer to being completely defenseless. When the ammunition ran out, he would be useless, unable to protect Tandleo, unable to contribute to the crew's survival. Dead weight in the tail, a liability instead of an asset. But that moment hadn't arrived yet. 683 rounds remained. He could still fight, he could still protect, he could still contribute. As long as 1 round remained, he was dangerous. As long as he was conscious, he was a threat to the Luftwaffe. As long as he was alive, he would fight. At 13:51, without any warning whatsoever, cannon shells exploded around the tail section. Massive impacts, tremendous violence, overwhelming force. A Focke-Wulf 190 had attacked from 5 o'clock position, slightly diagonal, partially in Aruth's blind spot. The fighter had fired a long burst of 20mm cannon shells, at least 10 rounds, walking them across Tandleo's tail section. 3 shells hit directly. The first shell struck the left gun mounting, completely destroying the already jammed weapon and shattering the hydraulic system. The second shell hit 6 inches from Aruth's left shoulder, penetrating the thin aluminum skin and exploding inside the compartment. The third shell struck the tail control surfaces, severing cables and damaging the rudder mechanism. The explosion of the second shell was catastrophic in the confined space. The shell fragmented into dozens of pieces of jagged metal traveling at tremendous velocity. Some fragments embedded in the structure. Some passed completely through. Some tore through Aruth's flight suit and heated suit and flesh. Aruth felt the impacts before his brain could process what had happened. Multiple sharp, piercing sensations in his left arm, left shoulder, and upper back. Hot, burning, immediate and intense pain that overwhelmed all other sensations. He was thrown forward by the blast, then slammed back into his seat. The plexiglass canopy shattered, exploding inward in thousands of small fragments. Cold air at 60 below zero rushed in through the holes, instantly dropping the temperature in the compartment. Blood appeared immediately, spreading across his flight suit in dark patches. The fragments had penetrated deep, tearing through muscle and tissue. Some struck bone, which hurt worse than anything he had ever experienced. His left arm went partially numb almost immediately, nerve damage or shock or both. The arm was still attached, but barely functional. The hydraulic fluid from the destroyed gun system sprayed everywhere, coating the compartment in slippery liquid that made everything harder to grip. The fluid froze almost instantly in the sub-zero air, creating ice patches on every surface. Aruth's mind processed all of this in perhaps 2 seconds. Pain, wounds, blood, cold, hydraulic fluid, shattered plexiglass, left gun completely destroyed, right gun still functional, ammunition still available, still alive, still conscious, still capable of fighting. The Focke-Wulf that had hit him was circling for another pass, coming around to 6 o'clock position where it could attack again, with Aruth wounded and vulnerable. The pilot had seen the hits, seen the damage, knew the tail gunner was hurt. This was an opportunity to finish the kill, to shoot down the bomber, to claim the victory. Aruth grabbed the control handles of his remaining gun with his right hand. His left hand was useless, hanging limp and unresponsive. He would have to aim and fire one-handed, using only his right hand to traverse, elevate, and trigger the weapon. This was extremely difficult under perfect conditions. Under current conditions, wounded and cold and bleeding and fighting alone, it was nearly impossible. But impossible didn't mean he would quit. Impossible didn't mean he would give up. Impossible didn't mean he would die without fighting. He positioned the gun, tracking the approaching fighter with one hand, compensating for the awkward grip, adjusting his aim through the gun sight. The fighter closed to 600 yards. 500, 400. Aruth waited, patient despite the pain, disciplined despite the fear. 300 yards. Now, he fired. The recoil was stronger than expected, with only one hand controlling the weapon. The gun wanted to traverse right, but he held it steady through strength and will. Tracers streamed out, 10 rounds in a quick burst. 2 rounds connected on the fighter's left wing. Not enough to kill, but enough to damage. The pilot saw the defensive fire, saw that the tail gunner was still active despite being wounded, made a calculation. The bomber was damaged, but still dangerous. The risk was too high. Better targets existed elsewhere. The fighter broke away, rolling left and diving, aborting the attack. Aruth released the trigger. 673 rounds remaining. 1 gun, 1 hand, 160 miles to England. Approximately 18 more attacks expected. Mathematics now truly desperate. The pain was increasing as adrenaline began to fade slightly. Sharp stabbing sensations with every breath. Dull, aching pain radiating from his shoulder and back. His left arm hung completely useless, numb and cold and unresponsive. Blood soaked his entire left side, warm initially but cooling rapidly in the sub-zero air, freezing on the outside of his flight suit. He needed to address the bleeding somehow. He pulled a scarf from his equipment bag, awkwardly one-handed, and wrapped it around his left shoulder and under his arm, creating improvised pressure and insulation. It wasn't proper medical treatment, but it was better than nothing. The pressure slowed the bleeding slightly. The insulation helped combat the deadly cold penetrating through the holes in his suit. The wounded area was freezing, literally freezing. The blood on the outside of his suit was ice. The exposed wounds were exposed to 60 below zero temperature. Frostbite was setting in rapidly. But oddly, this helped control the bleeding. The cold was cauterizing the wounds partially, slowing blood loss. 60 below zero was trying to kill him, but also helping keep him alive. War was full of such paradoxes. At 0:14:10, another attack developed. Single fighter from 6 o'clock high, Messerschmitt Bf-109. The pilot approached boldly, flying straight and level, exactly like the earlier fighter that Aruth had destroyed with the long burst. This pilot was either extraordinarily brave, or had poor judgment, or hadn't been informed about the dangerous American tail gunner. Aruth tracked the fighter one-handed, fighting to keep the gun steady despite the awkward grip and the pain radiating through his body with every movement. The fighter closed. 700 yards, 600, 500, still straight, still level, still perfect. At 450 yards, Aruth fired. He held the trigger down, pouring rounds into the approaching target, unable to fire short, precise bursts one-handed, forced to use continuous fire to maintain aim. Tracers streamed out. 10 rounds, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. The rounds connected everywhere on the fighter simultaneously. Engine, cockpit, wings, fuselage, tail. Every part of the aircraft was being hit. The 50 caliber rounds at this range had tremendous energy, tearing through aluminum, shattering components, destroying systems. The fighter began disintegrating in flight. The engine separated from the fuselage, falling away. The wings folded backward under stress. The cockpit canopy shattered. What remained of the fighter tumbled past Tandleo, close enough that Aruth could see inside the cockpit through his shattered plexiglass. Empty. The pilot had either ejected earlier or been killed by the defensive fire. The aircraft was just wreckage now, metal and fuel and ammunition falling toward Germany far below. Confirmed kill. Second of the return journey, third total of the mission, but the cost was severe. 60 rounds expended, 613 rounds remaining. One gun, one hand, wounded, bleeding, cold. 140 miles to England. 15 potential attacks remaining. The mathematics were now truly critical. 40 rounds per engagement average. That was barely adequate. He would have to be absolutely perfect for every remaining engagement. Every shot would have to count. Every decision would have to be correct. There was no margin for error. Zero. None. At 14:30, another attack came. 2 BF-109s from 6 o'clock level. Category 2, threat. Aruth fired at 500 yards, 12 rounds only. Short burst. The tracers connected. Lead fighter broke away. Wingman followed. 601 rounds remaining. At 14:45, France appeared below. They had crossed Belgium completely. Occupied France now, still hostile, but feeling closer to England. Another barrier crossed. Another milestone passed. Closer to survival. The fighters were diminishing. The Luftwaffe was reaching operational limits. Fuel low, ammunition depleted, pilots exhausted, attacks becoming less frequent, less coordinated, more opportunistic. At 1500, a lone Focke-Wulf attacked from 6 o'clock high. Single aircraft. Tired pilot. Minimal threat. Aruth fired at 400 yards. 8 rounds. The tracers passed close enough to intimidate. The pilot broke away. 593 rounds remaining. At 15:20, 2 more fighters attacked from 6 o'clock low. Difficult angle. Aruth fired at his gun's maximum depression. 12 rounds. 1 fighter took hits. Both broke away. 581 rounds remaining. At 15:35, the final attack occurred. A single Messerschmitt made a half-hearted approach from 7 o'clock, fired from extreme range, missed completely, and departed. Aruth didn't fire. Range too great. Threat minimal. Conservation paramount. Then the sky was empty. No more fighters. The Luftwaffe had withdrawn. Maximum range reached. The fighter threat was over. The bombers had survived. Aruth scanned his sector. Clear blue sky. Empty. Peaceful. For the first time in 3 hours, no fighters attacking, no tracers flying, no cannon shells exploding, just silence and cold and pain. He checked his ammunition counter. 581 rounds remaining. He had started with 1,600 rounds in 2 guns. He had expended over 1,000 rounds. But Tandleo was intact. The crew was alive. He had survived. But the mission wasn't over. 100 miles to England. Flak still possible. Wounds still bleeding. Cold still penetrating. 30 more minutes. Just 30. Stay conscious. Stay alert. Stay alive. The formation flew west through French airspace. Sporadic flak appeared, but inaccurate. More harassment than serious threat. The shells burst below their altitude or ahead of their position, ineffective. At 15:47, the French coast appeared. Final barrier. The Channel. 21 miles of cold water. Ditching meant death by hypothermia. But they weren't ditching. Engines running. Aircraft controllable. They would make it. Aruth's body temperature was dropping dangerously. The shattered plexiglass allowed 60 below zero air to pour into his compartment. The cold was penetrating everywhere. His teeth chattered, his hands shook, his skin was pale. Hypothermia was setting in. Shaking, confusion, drowsiness. The cold was killing him slowly. He had survived fighters, flak, and wounds, but the cold might kill him before reaching England. He fought the drowsiness. Sleep meant unconsciousness. Unconsciousness meant death. Stay awake. 30 minutes. Just 30. Keep eyes open. Keep breathing. Keep living. At 1600, the formation crossed the French coast and headed over the Channel. 6 minutes to England. 6 minutes to safety. 6 minutes to survival. Aruth watched the dark water far below. If they ditched now, he would die. Water too cold. But they weren't ditching. Engines running, aircraft flying. Almost there. At 1606, England appeared. White cliffs of Dover, brilliant white against dark water. Home, safety, survival, the most beautiful sight ever. They had made it. The formation crossed the English coast at 1610. Safe, home, alive, fighter threat gone, flak over, mission complete. Now just land and get treatment and survive. The formation broke up, groups turning toward home fields. Tandleo turned north toward Kimolton. Home. 15 minutes, just 15. Aruth felt consciousness wavering. Blood loss, cold, pain, exhaustion overwhelming him. Vision narrowing, hearing fading, body shutting down. But not yet, not now. 15 minutes. Stay awake, land, then rest. At 1625, Tandleo entered the landing pattern. The airfield appeared below. Home, safety, life. Bendener flew perfectly. Landing gear down. Flaps extended. Speed decreasing. Descending. The wheels touched at 1632. Smooth touchdown. Professional. Perfect. Brakes engaged. Aircraft slowed. Engines throttled. Down. Safe. Home. Tandleo rolled to her hardstand. Engines shut down. Propellers stopping. Silence. Only ticking metal and distant aircraft. The crew exited. Everyone alive. Everyone safe. But the tail gunner didn't appear. Aruth couldn't move. Conscious but unable to climb out. Wounds, blood loss, cold, exhaustion had depleted him. Still strapped in. Still at his post. He had protected the aircraft 6 hours. Fought off dozens of fighters. Fired almost 1,000 rounds. Taken 3 kills. But now he couldn't move. Crew Chief Thompson noticed the tail gunner hadn't emerged. He approached and looked inside. Aruth covered in blood. Flight suit soaked dark red. Compartment destroyed, but conscious. Eyes open. Looking back. Thompson shouted for medics. They came running with stretcher and bags, climbed into the tail, worked to extract the wounded gunner. Difficult, cramped space, wounded arm caught, working carefully. 5 minutes to extract him, loaded onto stretcher, into ambulance. Doors closed, engine started, driving to hospital, 5 minutes, every bump causing pain, but barely noticed. Alive, safe, going to survive. Ambulance arrived at hospital at 1652. Medics unloaded stretcher, carried inside. Dr. Williams took charge. They transferred Aruth to examination table, cut away flight suit, exposed wounds, 11 separate fragment wounds, left arm, shoulder, upper back, some fragments visible, most embedded deeper, needed x-rays. But immediate concern was blood loss and hypothermia, skin pale and cold, pulse rapid and weak, blood pressure low, in shock. Nurse started IV, warm saline. Another nurse applied warm blankets. Williams worked on wounds, cleaning, removing visible fragments, stopping bleeding, bandaging, morphine administered. Effect immediate. Sharp pain fading to dull ache. Tension releasing. Body relaxing. For first time in 6 hours, could let go, could rest. Williams counted wounds, 11 impacts, but none severed major vessels, None damaged vital organs. None destroyed nerves. Extraordinarily lucky. Would survive, would recover, would fly again. Williams noted patient sustained 11 fragment wounds, but continued fighting 90 minutes after being wounded. Extraordinary courage, deserved recognition, Purple Heart minimum, possibly higher decoration. Aruth lay on table, warm blankets, morphine dulling pain, 4 restoring blood volume, safe, being treated, going to survive, mission over, 6 hours takeoff to landing, 3 hours continuous combat, 12 attacks engaged, 3 confirmed kills, 1 gun jammed, 1 arm wounded, but alive, victorious. Through morphine haze, Aruth calculated, started 1,600 rounds, expended 999. Ended 601 remaining. Protected Tandleo completely. Crew safe. Mission accomplished. Theory validated. Doctrine challenged. The mathematics worked. The tactics worked. The aggression worked. Everything proven under most demanding test. He had been right. Doctrine had been wrong. Now others would learn. Others would adopt. Others would survive. Change had begun. Michael Aruth closed his eyes and let morphine carry him toward sleep. He had done enough, proven enough, survived enough. Now he could rest. He had earned it. Michael Aruth woke in the base hospital 12 hours after surgery, groggy from anesthesia and morphine, but alive and aware. The recovery ward was quiet in the pre-dawn darkness, filled with other wounded airmen recovering from their own battles. Some slept peacefully under medication. Others moaned softly in pain despite the drugs. A few lay silent and still, their injuries too severe for movement or sound. Aruth assessed his condition methodically through the fog of medication. His left arm was heavily bandaged and immobilized in a sling. His left shoulder and upper back were wrapped in layers of gauze and tape. His right leg below the knee was similarly bandaged. The wounds throbbed with steady, dull pain rather than the sharp agony of yesterday. The morphine was working adequately, though not perfectly. He tried moving his left arm experimentally. The fingers responded sluggishly, barely twitching. The wrist moved slightly. The elbow was locked by the sling. Sensation was returning gradually, pins and needles replacing numbness, which was both encouraging and painful. Nerve damage appeared minimal based on the returning sensation. The arm would probably recover full function eventually, though how long that would take remained unknown. Captain Williams, the flight surgeon, made rounds at 0600 hours, checking each patient systematically. When he reached Aruth's bed, he reviewed the chart carefully before speaking. The surgery had gone well. 8 shell fragments had been removed successfully from accessible locations in the shoulder, arm, and back. 3 fragments remained embedded too deep for safe removal without risking nerve or vessel damage. Those 3 would remain permanently small pieces of German steel that Aruth would carry for life. The wounds were clean and showing no signs of infection, which was the primary concern with any combat trauma. Antibiotics were being administered preventatively. The sutures were holding properly. Bleeding had stopped completely. The prognosis was good for full recovery, though the timeline would be measured in weeks rather than days. Williams estimated 6 to 8 weeks before the wounds healed sufficiently for normal activity. Flight status was more complicated. Combat flying placed extreme physical demands on crew members, demands that wounded bodies couldn't safely meet. Aruth's combat career was likely over, at least for this war. He might fly again eventually in training or transport roles, but returning to combat operations as a tail gunner seemed improbable given the extent of his injuries. Aruth accepted this assessment without complaint or protest. He had flown 13 combat missions. He had destroyed at least 6 enemy fighters with confirmed visual observation, possibly more depending on probables that might be verified through intelligence analysis and gun camera footage. He had survived when many others hadn't. He had proven his theories correct under the most extreme conditions imaginable. He had changed aerial gunnery tactics through example and teaching. If his combat flying was over, he had accomplished more than most gunners accomplished in entire tours of duty. But his influence on the war was far from over. In fact, it was only beginning. Word of Aruth's performance on the July 30th mission spread through the 379th Bombardment Group within hours. The intelligence debriefing report made the rounds. Tail gunner engaged numerous targets. 3 confirmed kills while wounded. Continued fighting with 1 gun and 1 arm for 90 minutes. Ammunition expenditure extremely high but tactically justified. Aircraft returned undamaged from fighter attacks due to aggressive defensive fire. The story grew with each telling, as stories always do. Some versions claimed he had shot down 5 fighters. Others said 7. Some said he had been wounded at the beginning of the mission and fought for 3 hours. Others added dramatic details about refusing medical evacuation and demanding to continue fighting. The truth was remarkable enough without embellishment, but embellishment happened anyway because men needed heroes, and Aruth had provided heroism. More importantly than the stories, the tactics he had pioneered and taught were spreading rapidly through the entire 8th Air Force Bomber Command. The 4 tail gunners he had personally trained, Jenkins, Martinez, Williams, and Corporal Davis, were now teaching others. Each of them had survived multiple missions using Aruth's methods. Each had combat results that validated the approach. Each was now surrounded by other gunners asking questions, seeking instruction, wanting to learn. The progression was exponential. 4 trained gunners became 12. 12 became 30. 30 became over 100 within 2 weeks of the July 30th mission. The unofficial network of aggressive fire tail gunners was growing faster than any official doctrine change could propagate through military bureaucracy. The results were becoming statistically significant and impossible to ignore. Squadrons with high concentrations of Aruth-trained gunners showed measurably lower bomber loss rates than squadrons still following standard doctrine. The difference wasn't dramatic, perhaps 2 or 3 percentage points, but in an environment where loss rates regularly hit 10 to 15%, 2 or 3 points represented dozens of lives saved and dozens of bombers preserved. The 379th Bombardment Group's gunnery officer, Captain Thomas Morrison, was the first mid-level officer to formally recognize the pattern. Morrison was responsible for all defensive gunnery training and performance evaluation within the group. He reviewed mission reports daily, tracked ammunition expenditure, analyzed gun camera footage, and compiled statistics on gunner effectiveness. By mid-August, Morrison's data showed clear patterns. Tail gunners using early engagement tactics averaged 40% fewer hits on their aircraft compared to doctrine-following gunners. The early engagement gunners fired approximately double the ammunition per mission, but achieved triple the number of fighter disruptions and actual kills. The mathematics favored aggression overwhelmingly, despite the increased ammunition consumption. Morrison compiled a detailed report and forwarded it to Group Headquarters with a recommendation to formally evaluate changing the tail gunner engagement doctrine. This report reached the desk of Colonel Morris Preston, the 379th Bomb Group commander, in late August 1943. Preston was a professional career officer, West Point class of 1931, with extensive pre-war flying experience and strong opinions about proper military procedure. He disliked unofficial innovations and informal training networks that bypassed official channels. But Preston was also pragmatic and results-focused. When data showed that something worked better than existing methods, he paid attention regardless of how he personally felt about the source. Preston read Morrison's report carefully, reviewed the supporting data, examined the mission reports from multiple squadrons, and reached a conclusion. The aggressive early engagement tactics appeared effective based on preliminary evidence. However, the sample size was still relatively small and the observation period was short. More data was needed before recommending changes to 8th Air Force headquarters. Preston directed Morrison to continue monitoring gunner performance and compile monthly statistical summaries. He also directed squadron commanders to neither encourage nor discourage gunners from adopting the new tactics. Let individual gunners and crews decide based on their own assessment of risk versus reward. This was a deliberate non-decision that allowed innovation to continue spreading while avoiding official endorsement of unauthorized methods. Meanwhile, the impact was spreading beyond the 379th Bombardment Group. Replacement crews were constantly arriving from the United States and being distributed across all groups in 8th Bomber Command. These new crews trained together at bases in America, then flew to England as formed units. When they arrived, they were assigned to operational groups and quickly learned local practices from experienced crews. The new crews arriving at bases where Aruth-trained gunners were common quickly learned aggressive engagement tactics as standard procedure rather than innovative deviation. These replacement crews didn't know this was controversial or unofficial. They simply learned what the experienced survivors were doing and adopted those methods immediately. When these crews rotated to other groups, or when individual crew members were reassigned, they carried the tactics with them. By September 1943, aggressive early engagement tactics for tail gunners had spread to at least 6 different bomb groups across 8th Air Force. The exact percentage of gunners using the new methods was unknown because no formal survey existed, but estimates ranged from 20 to 30% of all tail gunners in the command. The Luftwaffe noticed the change before American headquarters did. German fighter pilots reported that American tail gunners were engaging at longer ranges, firing more aggressively, and disrupting attacks more effectively. The intelligence reports from debriefed pilots were consistent and concerning. American defensive tactics were evolving in ways that increased the danger to German fighters while apparently not depleting defensive ammunition as rapidly as expected. The Luftwaffe responded with tactical adjustments of their own. Fighter formations began attacking from angles that minimized exposure to tail gunner fire. More attacks came from 12 o'clock high, directly ahead of bombers where tail gunners couldn't engage. Approach speeds increased to reduce exposure time. Attack coordination improved to saturate defenses with simultaneous threats from multiple angles. But these adjustments had their own costs. Attacking from the front required higher closure rates and gave pilots less time to aim accurately. Increased approach speeds consumed fuel faster and reduced time on station. Better coordination required more training and better communication, neither of which was unlimited. The Luftwaffe was adapting, but the adaptation imposed costs and constraints that reduced overall effectiveness. The result was a competitive evolution, an arms race in tactics and techniques. Americans improved defense, Germans improved offense. Americans adapted further, Germans countered again. Neither side achieved permanent advantage, but the continuous evolution favored the side with greater resources, better training pipelines, and higher replacement rates. That side was the Americans. Back at the base hospital, Aruth was progressing through recovery week by week. By early August, he could walk short distances with assistance. His left arm remained weak but functional. The wounds were healing cleanly. The pain was manageable with minimal medication. He spent his days reading, talking with other wounded crew members, and receiving visitors from his squadron. Lieutenant Bendener visited regularly, bringing updates about Tandleo and the crew. The aircraft had been repaired and returned to service. The tail section had required extensive work replacing damaged structure and control cables. The plexiglass had been completely replaced. New guns had been installed. The bomber was flying again with the same crew minus Aruth. The replacement tail gunner was a young sergeant named Robert Coleman, 20 years old, fresh from gunnery school, on his first operational assignment. Bendener reported that Coleman was nervous but capable, and most importantly, had sought out one of Aruth's trained students to learn the aggressive engagement tactics before his first mission. This was now happening throughout the command. New gunners arriving from training schools immediately sought out experienced gunners who could teach them the survival methods that doctrine didn't cover. Jenkins, Martinez, Williams, and Davis visited as a group in mid-August. They brought news that all four had been promoted to staff sergeant in recognition of their combat performance and their informal role training other gunners. They also brought statistics they had compiled among themselves. Collectively, the four of them had flown 68 combat missions since learning Aruth's methods. 0 fatalities, 0 serious wounds, 2 minor shrapnel injuries that required brief medical treatment, but no mission abort, 4 confirmed kills among them with multiple probables. More significantly, they reported that they personally knew at least 30 other tail gunners now using the aggressive engagement methods. Of those 30 gunners, 28 were still alive and flying. The 2 casualties had been lost to flak rather than fighter attacks, meaning their gunner tactics were irrelevant to their deaths. The survival rate was remarkable compared to the overall tail gunner casualty rates in 8th Air Force. By late August, Aruth was walking without assistance, and his arm strength was returning gradually. Captain Williams cleared him for light duty, but not for flight status. Aruth was reassigned to the Group Gunnery Training Section, where he could contribute without flying combat missions. His official role was assisting with new gunner orientation and providing combat perspective during training lectures. His actual role quickly became something more significant. New tail gunners sought him out constantly, asking questions, seeking advice, wanting to learn from the man whose tactics were saving lives across the entire command. Aruth found himself teaching daily, explaining the geometry and mathematics of defensive gunnery, describing threat assessment and categorization, demonstrating one-handed gun control techniques, discussing ammunition management and tactical decision-making. The instruction was still informal and unofficial. The training curriculum hadn't changed. The gunnery manual still taught weight and conserve doctrine. But between the official classes, in the barracks at night, during meals in the mess hall, Aruth taught what actually worked in combat. The unofficial curriculum was becoming more influential than the official one. In September, Captain Morrison completed his second monthly statistical analysis, and the results were even more compelling than August. Bomber groups with high adoption rates of aggressive engagement tactics showed loss rates averaging 8.3% compared to 10.7% for groups with low adoption rates. The difference of 2.4 percentage points represented 24 bombers saved per 1,000 sorties and 240 crew members not killed or captured. Morrison forwarded this analysis to Colonel Preston with a renewed recommendation to formally adopt the aggressive engagement tactics as official doctrine. Preston reviewed the data carefully and made a decision. He would forward Morrison's report to 8th Air Force Headquarters with his endorsement, but without requiring immediate action. The evidence was suggestive, but not yet conclusive. The observation period was still relatively short. More data from more groups over longer periods would strengthen the case. But Preston also took an important intermediate step. He directed that the 379th Bomb Group's internal gunnery training should incorporate aggressive engagement techniques as an approved option rather than unauthorized deviation. Instructors should teach both the standard doctrine and the aggressive alternative, explain the advantages and risks of each, and allow gunners to choose which approach suited their judgment and temperament. This was the first official recognition that Aruth's methods had merit, even though it stopped short of formal doctrine change. Other group commanders heard about Preston's decision through the informal network of professional communication that existed among senior officers. Several other groups quietly adopted similar policies over the following weeks. By October 1943, approximately 40% of tail gunners in 8th Bomber Command were using some variation of aggressive early engagement tactics. The exact techniques varied because the teaching was informal and each instructor emphasized different aspects, but the core principle was universal. Engage early, disrupt attacks before they develop, accept higher ammunition consumption as the price of survival. The statistical results continued accumulating. Groups with high adoption showed consistently lower loss rates. Individual gunners using the methods showed higher survival rates. Aircraft with aggressive tail gunners sustained less battle damage. The pattern held across different squadrons, different groups, different target priorities, and different enemy defensive tactics. In November, 8th Air Force Headquarters received formal reports from 4 different bomb group commanders recommending evaluation of changes to defensive gunnery doctrine. The reports cited statistical evidence, individual gunner testimonials, combat film analysis, and enemy intelligence reports, all pointing toward the effectiveness of aggressive early engagement. The headquarters staff forwarded these reports to the 8th Air Force Gunnery Board, a committee of senior officers and technical experts responsible for evaluating tactics and recommending doctrine changes. The board scheduled a formal review for December with plans to observe combat missions, interview gunners, analyze data, and potentially recommend changes to official training and doctrine. Meanwhile, the human cost of the doctrine debate continued accumulating. Every mission, tail gunners made decisions about when to fire and how much to fire. Some followed standard doctrine and some died because of it. Some followed Aruth's methods, and most survived because of it. The correlation wasn't perfect. Luck still mattered. Random chance still killed. But the statistics were clear. Aggression saved lives. Back at Kimolton, Aruth continued his unofficial teaching role through October and November. His wounds were healed enough that he no longer needed bandages or medication. His left arm had recovered perhaps 80% of its strength and range of motion, enough for normal activities, but probably insufficient for operating twin 50 caliber machine guns in combat. The 3 shell fragments still embedded in his shoulder and back caused occasional pain, but nothing debilitating. Captain Williams reevaluated his flight status in November and rendered a decision. Aruth was medically cleared for non-combat flying, including training missions, ferry flights, and transport operations. But return to combat operations was not recommended due to reduced upper body strength and range of motion. The decision wasn't final or permanent. Further recovery might eventually allow combat clearance. But for now, Aruth's combat flying was over. Aruth accepted this without complaint. He had done his combat flying. He had proven what needed proving. He had changed tactics and saved lives. Now he could contribute differently by teaching others to survive, as he had survived. In December, the Gunnery Board conducted its formal evaluation. A team of officers observed multiple combat missions from various bomber groups. They interviewed dozens of tail gunners about their tactics and experiences. They reviewed months of statistical data compiled by group gunnery officers. They analyzed gun camera footage showing engagement ranges and ammunition expenditure patterns. They read after-action reports describing defensive effectiveness. The board's preliminary conclusions were cautiously favorable toward aggressive engagement tactics. The evidence suggested that early engagement did disrupt fighter attacks more effectively than delayed engagement. The higher ammunition consumption was offset by better defensive outcomes. Individual gunner survival rates were measurably higher. Aircraft damage rates were measurably lower. However, the board also identified concerns and caveats. Aggressive engagement required better gunner training to maintain accuracy at extended ranges. Ammunition logistics became more challenging when consumption rates doubled. Gun barrel wear increased with sustained high-volume fire. Not all gunners possessed the judgment or temperament for aggressive tactics. The board's draft recommendation, circulated in late December, proposed modifying official doctrine to authorize aggressive engagement as an approved tactical option while retaining wait and conserve as the baseline. Gunners would be trained in both approaches and allowed to choose based on combat conditions and personal assessment. This represented compromise rather than full endorsement, but it was still significant progress toward official recognition. By year's end, the impact of Aruth's innovation was undeniable. Approximately 50% of 8th Air Force tail gunners were using some form of aggressive early engagement. Loss rates for bombers with aggressive tail gunners averaged 2 to 3 percentage points lower than bombers with doctrine-following gunners. Over the 6 months from July through December 1943, this difference represented approximately 150 bombers saved and 1,500 crew members not killed or captured. One man's calculated risk and determined survival had cascaded into a movement that changed how thousands of gunners fought and how hundreds of bombers survived. The doctrine was evolving, the Air Force was learning, the war was being fought more effectively because one tail gunner questioned established procedures and proved his alternative worked better. Aruth received official recognition in January 1944 when he was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his actions on July 30th. The citation mentioned his 3 confirmed kills while wounded, his continued fighting despite injuries, and his tactical innovations that improved defensive effectiveness. The medal ceremony was small and informal, held at Kimolton with his squadron in attendance. More meaningful than the medal was the knowledge that his methods were now semi-officially approved. The revised Gunnery Manual, issued in February 1944, included a section describing aggressive engagement tactics as an authorized alternative approach. The section didn't mention Aruth by name, but everyone who read it knew where those tactics originated. Doctrine had caught up with reality. Official policy now reflected what combat survivors had known for months. The Luftwaffe continued adapting throughout this period. Fighter tactics evolved continuously in response to improved American defenses. Attack angles shifted, coordination improved, new weapons entered service. But the fundamental dynamic had changed. American bomber formations were more dangerous to attack than they had been 6 months earlier. German fighter pilots were more cautious. American losses decreased slightly. German losses increased slightly. The attrition balance shifted incrementally, but importantly, in favor of the Americans. Aruth's personal war changed as well. In February 1944, he received orders transferring him from operational status to training command. He would return to the United States to serve as a gunnery instructor at training schools, teaching new gunners the tactics that had kept him alive and were now saving hundreds of others. His combat flying was definitely over. His teaching career was just beginning. Before departing England, Aruth visited the 379th Bomb Group one final time in March. Tandleo was still flying with the same crew, minus the original tail gunner. Coleman, the replacement, had completed 20 missions and credited Aruth's methods with his survival. Jenkins, Martinez, Williams, and Davis were all still alive with 50-plus missions each. The informal network of trained gunners had expanded to over 200 individuals across multiple groups. Colonel Preston personally thanked Aruth for his service and his contribution to improving defensive tactics. The thanks was genuine and well-deserved. The 379th Bomb Group's loss rates had declined from 15% in early summer to 9% in winter, and improved gunnery accounted for a significant portion of that improvement. Aruth departed England in late March 1944 aboard a transport aircraft headed back to the United States. He looked down at the English countryside disappearing below and reflected on what had changed. 13 combat missions, 6 confirmed kills, 3 shell fragments still carried in his body, dozens of men trained personally, hundreds trained indirectly, thousands using tactics he pioneered, hundreds of lives saved, doctrine changed, war fought better. One man couldn't win a war alone, but one man could change how the war was fought. One man could prove that established procedures weren't always optimal. One man could demonstrate that calculated risk sometimes offered better survival than conservative caution. One man could teach others and multiply his impact through their survival and their subsequent teaching. Michael Aruth had been that one man. His combat flying was over, but his influence would continue long after the war ended. Every military historian studying air warfare would eventually encounter the tactical evolution of bomber defensive gunnery in 1943 and 44. Some would understand that evolution originated with one wounded tail gunner who questioned doctrine, tested alternatives, survived to teach others, and changed how thousands fought. The numbers told the story clearly. Before Aruth's innovation, tail gunner casualty rates exceeded 50% over a 30-mission tour. After widespread adoption of his tactics, casualty rates declined to approximately 35%. 15 percentage points represented roughly 450 tail gunners surviving their tours instead of dying. 450 men who returned home to families instead of appearing on casualty lists. That was Aruth's real legacy. Not the medals or the recognition or the historical footnotes. The legacy was measured in men who lived because he taught them how. 450 families who weren't destroyed, 450 futures that continued instead of ending. 450 individual human lives preserved through tactical innovation and determined teaching. Wars are fought by nations and decided by industries and recorded by historians, but wars are also fought by individuals making moment-by-moment decisions about survival and teaching others what they learned. Aruth was one such individual. His decisions rippled outward through informal networks and official channels until they changed how an entire military branch fought its air war. As the transport aircraft carried him west across the Atlantic toward America and home and safety and a different kind of service, Michael Aruth understood his war had been successful not because he killed enemies, but because he saved friends. That was the victory that mattered. That was the contribution that endured. That was the legacy worth leaving. Behind him, the war in Europe continued for another 14 months until Germany surrendered in May 1945. During those 14 months, thousands of bomber missions flew into German airspace. Thousands of tail gunners defended their aircraft using aggressive engagement tactics descended from Aruth's innovation. Thousands of fighters were driven off or destroyed. Thousands of bombers returned that might otherwise have been lost. Thousands of crew members survived. The exact numbers were impossible to calculate precisely. Attributing survival to any single factor in the chaos of combat was inherently imprecise, but the statistical correlation was clear and compelling. Aggressive engagement worked better than patient waiting. Early fire saved more lives than conserved ammunition. Aruth's methods, refined and taught and spread through informal networks, contributed measurably to improved survival rates across 8th Air Force. That contribution didn't end when Aruth left England. It continued as long as gunners used the tactics he pioneered. It continued through the remaining months of the European War. It continued in subsequent conflicts where American bomber crews faced enemy fighters. It continued whenever military planners studied historical cases of tactical innovation originating from field experience rather than theoretical analysis. Aruth's story became a teaching case at military academies and staff colleges, not because he was unique, though his personal courage was certainly remarkable, rather because he exemplified a pattern that appeared repeatedly in military history. A frontline soldier recognizes that established doctrine is failing. He develops an alternative through experience and experimentation. He tests it under combat conditions. He teaches it to others. It spreads through informal networks. Eventually, official doctrine catches up with field reality. This pattern has appeared in every war throughout history. The specific details vary, but the fundamental dynamic remains constant. Ground truth eventually overwhelms theoretical doctrine. Field experience eventually corrects classroom assumptions. Survival imperatives eventually drive tactical evolution regardless of official approval. Aruth's contribution was recognizing this dynamic and deliberately accelerating it. He didn't just survive using better tactics. He taught those tactics to others before official channels recognized their value. He created an informal teaching network that spread innovation faster than bureaucratic processes could have propagated changes. He became a multiplier of effectiveness, amplifying his personal impact through the survival and subsequent teaching of those he trained. This multiplicative effect was his most important innovation. The tactics themselves were relatively simple once understood. Engage early, disrupt attacks, accept ammunition expenditure. These weren't complex concepts requiring advanced training, but recognizing their value required combat experience that most gunners didn't survive long enough to acquire. Aruth survived. He recognized. He taught. Others survived because he taught them. Then they taught others. The multiplication continued through successive generations of combat veterans. By war's end in August 1945, aggressive engagement tactics had become standard practice throughout American bomber forces. The official Gunnery manual reflected this reality. Training schools taught early engagement as primary doctrine rather than optional alternative. New gunners learned Aruth's methods from day one of their training rather than discovering them through combat trial and error. The transition from field innovation to official doctrine had taken approximately 18 months from Aruth's first combat tests in June 1943 to full incorporation in training materials by late 1944. This was actually remarkably fast for military bureaucracy. Typically, doctrine changes required years of study, debate, testing, and approval. The rapid adoption of aggressive engagement tactics reflected both the compelling statistical evidence and the ground-up pressure from combat survivors who knew the methods worked. Michael Aruth spent the remainder of the war teaching gunnery at training bases in the United States. He trained hundreds of gunners directly and influenced thousands indirectly through the curriculum, changes his combat experience validated. After the war ended, he remained in service for several more years before retiring in 1962 as a master sergeant with 37 years total service. His post-war life was quiet and private. He married, raised a family, and rarely spoke about his combat experiences. The medals stayed in a drawer. The memories stayed locked away. Like many veterans of his generation, Aruth believed those who hadn't been there couldn't truly understand, so discussion was pointless. But the impact endured regardless of his silence. Every tail gunner who survived because of tactics Aruth pioneered represented his living legacy. Every bomber that returned because aggressive defensive fire disrupted attacks validated his contribution. Every family that welcomed home a loved one instead of receiving a telegram owed partial debt to an innovation they probably never knew about. When Aruth died in 1990 at age 70, his obituary mentioned his World War II service and his medals, but said nothing about changing defensive gunnery tactics or saving hundreds of lives through teaching. The obituary writer didn't know those details. Most people didn't know. The contribution had been real and significant, but largely uncelebrated and unrecognized outside military history circles. The true measure of success in war is not glory or recognition. It's survival. It's helping others survive. It's leaving the battlefield with more of your people alive than dead. By that measure, Michael Aruth's war was extraordinarily successful. He survived 13 combat missions during the deadliest period of the air war over Europe. He destroyed at least 6 enemy aircraft. He was wounded in action, but recovered. He taught dozens of gunners directly and hundreds indirectly. He influenced doctrine changes that improved survival rates across the entire command. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. Michael Aruth arrived back in the United States in early April 1944 after nearly 2 years overseas. The transport aircraft landed at Mitchell Field on Long Island, New York, where returning combat veterans were processed through military bureaucracy before receiving their next assignments. The process took 3 days of medical examinations, paperwork review, personnel interviews, and administrative processing. The medical examination confirmed Captain Williams's assessment from England. Aruth's wounds had healed adequately for normal activity and non-combat flying. His left arm retained approximately 85% of pre-injury strength and range of motion. The 3 shell fragments still embedded in his shoulder and back were stable and causing no acute problems. Occasional pain was expected and manageable. He was cleared for full duty except combat operations. His combat record was reviewed carefully by personnel officers, evaluating his skills and determining optimal assignment. 13 combat missions completed, 6 enemy aircraft destroyed with confirmed visual observation, additional probables pending verification, Distinguished Flying Cross awarded, Purple Heart for wounds received in action, combat experience spanning 7 months from June through December 1943 during the deadliest phase of the air war over Europe. But the personnel officers were most interested in something not formally documented in his service record. Multiple letters and endorsements from senior officers described Aruth's development of improved defensive gunnery tactics and his informal teaching that had spread those tactics throughout 8th Air Force. The letters emphasized his teaching ability and recommended assignment to gunnery instruction rather than operational units. The assignment came through on April 7th. Aruth would report to the Army Air Force's Flexible Gunnery School at Laredo Army Airfield in Texas. This was one of several training installations teaching aerial gunnery to new recruits before they deployed overseas. The school needed experienced combat instructors who could teach practical survival skills rather than just theoretical procedures. Aruth traveled by train from New York to Texas, a journey of 3 days across the American continent. The transition from combat zone to peaceful homeland was psychologically jarring. England had been at war for 4 years, showing the strain through rationing, blackouts, bombed cities, and constant military activity. America was also at war, but the home front looked and felt completely different. Cities were intact, Food was abundant despite rationing. Civilian life continued with minimal disruption. The war seemed distant and abstract rather than immediate and deadly. He reported to Laredo on April 15th and was assigned to the Advanced Gunnery Training Section. This section taught the final phase of gunnery school, where students practiced defensive tactics, threat recognition, ammunition management, and combat procedures. The training culminated in practice missions aboard B-17S and B-24s, flying simulated combat profiles while students operated the defensive guns. The existing curriculum at Laredo followed standard Army Air Forces doctrine. Engage targets at 300 yards, fire short controlled bursts, conserve ammunition, wait for optimal firing solution. These were the same procedures that had nearly gotten Aruth killed and had killed many others he knew. The curriculum was based on theoretical analysis and peacetime testing rather than combat experience from the actual war being fought daily over Europe. Aruth's first assignment was observing existing training to understand the curriculum and procedures. He spent 2 weeks watching instructors teach, observing students practice, flying training missions as an observer, and noting everything that diverged from combat reality. The list of divergences was extensive and concerning. The training emphasized accuracy over disruption. Students were taught to fire only when they had perfect aim and high probability of hitting. This was appropriate for target practice, but inappropriate for combat, where disruption mattered more than destruction. A fighter that broke off its attack due to defensive fire was neutralized regardless of whether rounds actually hit. The training emphasized ammunition conservation over aggressive defense. Students were penalized for excessive firing and praised for minimal expenditure. This created gunners who were afraid to shoot, who hesitated at critical moments, who died because they waited too long. The training used unrealistic scenarios where attacking aircraft approached slowly and predictably from standard angles. Real combat featured high-speed approaches from multiple angles simultaneously, with minimal warning and maximum chaos. Students trained on easy targets became casualties when facing real threats. Most critically, the training taught absolutely nothing about threat assessment, tactical decision-making, or adaptive techniques. Students learned procedures to follow rather than judgment to exercise. They memorized doctrine rather than understanding principles. They became technicians rather than tactical thinkers. Aruth documented his observations in detailed written reports submitted to the school commander, Colonel James Harrison. The reports were diplomatic but clear. Current training was producing gunners who would struggle to survive combat against experienced Luftwaffe pilots using current tactics. Changes were needed urgently. Colonel Harrison reviewed Aruth's reports with interest. Harrison was a career training officer who had never flown combat missions himself, but was intelligent enough to recognize that combat veterans possessed knowledge that training officers lacked. He invited Aruth to propose specific curriculum changes and authorized testing those changes with selected student groups. Aruth developed a revised curriculum over 3 weeks in May 1944. The changes were extensive but focused on core principles rather than minor details. The revised curriculum emphasized 5 critical concepts that standard training either minimized or ignored completely. First, early engagement. Students would be taught to open fire at 600 to 800 yards rather than waiting for 300 yards. The reasoning would be explained clearly. Early fire disrupts enemy attacks before they fully develop. Fighters forced to maneuver defensively cannot aim accurately. Disruption is as valuable as destruction. Survival requires preventing successful attacks, not just responding to them. Second, threat assessment. Students would learn to quickly categorize approaching fighters based on pilot skill, formation discipline, approach angle, and aggression level. Different threats required different responses. Maximum threats received heavy fire intended to kill or cripple. Moderate threats received suppressive fire intended to disrupt. Minimal threats received warning fire intended to intimidate. Understanding this categorization improved tactical decision-making and ammunition management. Third, ammunition management through tactical choice rather than blanket conservation. Students would understand that ammunition was a tool to be used when needed rather than a resource to be hoarded. Better to expend ammunition aggressively and survive than conserve ammunition carefully and die. But ammunition management remained important through intelligent threat assessment and proportional response rather than uniform restriction. Fourth, one-handed gun operation and degraded capability procedures. Combat produced wounded gunners, damaged equipment, and reduced capability situations constantly. Students needed training on how to continue fighting effectively despite degraded conditions. One-handed gun control, single gun operation, improvised repairs, all these emergency procedures needed practice before combat made them necessary. Fifth, tactical thinking and adaptive behavior. Students needed to understand principles and reasoning behind tactics rather than just memorizing procedures. Understanding allowed adaptation when circumstances changed. Memorization failed when situations diverged from training scenarios. Combat required thinkers, not technicians. Colonel Harrison approved testing the revised curriculum with one training class of 40 students while maintaining standard curriculum for comparison classes. The test would run through June and July, with results evaluated in August. This was a proper scientific approach: controlled comparison, measurable outcomes, statistical analysis. The test class began training under the revised curriculum on June 1st. Aruth was the primary instructor with 2 assistant instructors who were also combat veterans recently returned from Europe. The 40 students had completed basic gunnery training and were beginning advanced tactical training. They were raw material, young and inexperienced, but motivated and capable of learning. The training was immediately different from standard curriculum in both content and teaching style. Instead of lecturing about procedures, Aruth discussed principles and reasoning. Instead of drilling rote memorization, he encouraged questions and discussion. Instead of penalizing mistakes harshly, he treated errors as learning opportunities. The classroom atmosphere was less formal but more intellectually engaging. The students responded enthusiastically. These were intelligent young men who had volunteered for dangerous duty and wanted to survive that duty. When someone explained how to survive using logic and combat experience rather than theory and doctrine, they paid attention intensely. When someone encouraged them to think tactically rather than follow procedures blindly, they engaged actively. The practical training was equally different. Students fired thousands of practice rounds at targets at extended ranges. They practiced identifying threat categories based on brief visual observations. They practiced one-handed gun control and single gun operation. They practiced making tactical decisions under time pressure with incomplete information. They learned to think and adapt rather than just follow procedures. The comparison between test class and standard curriculum classes became apparent during practice missions in July. Both groups flew simulated combat missions aboard B-17s with instructors playing the role of attacking fighters using camera guns to record student responses. The scenarios were identical for both groups. The results were dramatically different. Standard curriculum students waited until 300 yards as trained, fired short bursts as trained, and were frequently killed by camera gun footage showing them dead before they could engage effectively. Test curriculum students engaged at 600 to 800 yards as trained, fired aggressively as trained, and usually disrupted the simulated attacks before camera guns could achieve effective firing positions. The statistical results were compiled carefully. Standard curriculum students successfully disrupted attacks 43% of the time. Test curriculum students disrupted attacks 78%. Standard curriculum students averaged 1.7 seconds response time from threat appearance to first rounds fired. Test curriculum students averaged 0.9 seconds. Standard curriculum students expended average 320 rounds per mission. Test curriculum students expended average 640 rounds per mission, but achieved double the defensive success. Colonel Harrison reviewed these results in early August and made an immediate decision. The revised curriculum would become standard for all advanced gunnery training at Laredo beginning September 1st. All instructors would receive training on the new curriculum during August. All future classes would learn Aruth's methods as primary doctrine rather than experimental alternative. This was significant. Laredo trained approximately 2,000 aerial gunners annually. Those gunners deployed to combat units throughout the world. Starting September 1944, 2,000 gunners per year would arrive at operational units already trained in aggressive engagement tactics developed from Aruth's combat experience. The multiplication effect was enormous, but Laredo was just one school. The Army Air Forces operated 7 flexible gunnery schools across the United States, each training between 1,000 and 3,000 gunners annually. If all 7 schools adopted the revised curriculum, 10 to 15,000 gunners per year would learn improved survival tactics. Colonel Harrison forwarded his evaluation report and recommendation to Army Air Forces Training Command Headquarters in Fort Worth, Texas. The report documented the testing methodology, presented the statistical results, and recommended adoption of the revised curriculum at all gunnery schools. The report included strong endorsement from Harrison and detailed curriculum materials developed by Aruth. Training Command reviewed the report through September and October. Multiple staff officers visited Laredo to observe training, interview students, and evaluate the program personally. The consensus was favorable. The revised curriculum produced measurably better results. The statistical evidence was compelling. The combat veteran instructor credentials were impeccable. The recommendation was approved. In November 1944, Training Command issued new curriculum guidelines for all flexible gunnery schools. The guidelines incorporated Aruth's principles and many of his specific techniques. Early engagement was now standard teaching. Threat assessment was required curriculum. Ammunition management through tactical choice replaced blanket conservation. The official doctrine had caught up with combat reality. The impact was immediate and exponential. Beginning January 1945, all new aerial gunners completing training learned aggressive engagement tactics as standard procedure. They deployed to combat units in Europe and the Pacific already trained in methods that had been developed in European combat and proven effective through 18 months of unofficial field testing. Meanwhile, the war in Europe was entering its final phase. Germany was being ground down from east and west simultaneously. Soviet armies were advancing relentlessly from the east. American and British forces were pushing through France toward Germany from the west. Strategic bombing continued daily, systematically destroying German industrial capacity and transportation networks. The bomber losses that had been catastrophic in 1943 had decreased substantially by late 1944. Multiple factors contributed to this improvement. Long-range fighter escorts could now accompany bombers all the way to targets and back. German fighter strength was depleted by losses and fuel shortages. German pilot quality declined as experienced veterans were killed and replaced by inadequately trained novices. But improved defensive gunnery also contributed measurably. Bombers were more dangerous to attack than they had been a year earlier. Tail gunners engaged earlier and more aggressively. Defensive fire disrupted attacks more effectively. German pilots were more cautious, less willing to press attacks through heavy fire. The cumulative effect was fewer successful attacks, less damage per attack, lower bomber losses. Precise attribution was impossible because multiple factors operated simultaneously, but statistical analysis suggested that improved gunnery accounted for perhaps 20 to 30% of the bomber loss reduction. This translated to hundreds of bombers saved and thousands of crew members surviving missions they might otherwise not have survived. Aruth continued teaching at Laredo through the end of the European War in May 1945. He trained approximately 800 gunners directly during his 14 months at the school. Those 800 gunners deployed to combat units, some reaching Europe before the war ended in May, others deploying to the Pacific Theater, where the war against Japan continued through August. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, after atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Second World War ended completely. The massive military mobilization began demobilizing immediately. Millions of servicemen returned to civilian life. Training schools closed, combat units disbanded. The military machine that had grown to enormous size during 4 years of war contracted rapidly toward peacetime levels. Aruth had the option to leave active service and return to civilian life. Many veterans took that option eagerly, wanting nothing more than to put the war behind them and resume normal lives. But Aruth chose differently. He had joined the military in January 1942 and had now served 3.5 years. The military had become his career and his identity. He decided to remain on active duty. The newly independent United States Air Force, which separated from the Army in 1947, needed experienced personnel to build the post-war force structure. Aruth's combination of combat experience and training expertise made him valuable. He received assignments to various training commands over the next 15 years, teaching aerial gunnery, weapons systems, and defensive tactics. The specific aircraft and weapon systems changed as technology advanced. The B-17 and B-24 bombers of World War II were replaced by B-29 Superfortresses, then B-36 Peacemakers, then B-47 Stratojets, then B-52 Stratofortresses. The 50-caliber machine guns were supplemented and eventually replaced by 20mm cannons and eventually by electronic countermeasures and missiles. But the fundamental principles of defensive tactics remained relevant. Engage early, disrupt attacks, think tactically, adapt to circumstances. Aruth retired from active duty in 1962 at age 43 with 20 years total service and the rank of Master Sergeant. His service record documented 13 combat missions, 6 confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed, Distinguished Flying Cross, Purple Heart, and 2 decades of training assignment. What the record didn't adequately capture was his influence on tactical doctrine and his role in saving hundreds or thousands of lives through improved training. His retirement was quiet and without ceremony. He had never sought recognition or publicity. He had done his duty as he understood it, survived his war, and helped others survive theirs. That was enough. That was everything. Post-retirement life was equally quiet. He married a woman named Margaret, whom he had met during a training assignment in California. They settled in a small house in the Sacramento suburbs. No children, no extended family. Just 2 people living simple, peaceful lives, far from war and military service. Aruth rarely spoke about his combat experiences, even to Margaret. The memories were private and painful, the friends lost, the fear endured, the wounds suffered. These weren't topics for casual conversation. When pressed, he would acknowledge he had served as an aerial gunner during the war, had flown combat missions over Germany, had been wounded and recovered. Details beyond that remained locked away. He worked civilian jobs for 15 years after military retirement, mostly technical positions that used his mechanical aptitude and problem-solving abilities. He worked as an aircraft mechanic at Sacramento Municipal Airport for 5 years. He worked as a maintenance supervisor for a commercial warehouse for 8 years. He worked as a technical inspector for a manufacturing company for 2 years before fully retiring in 1977 at age 58. The decades passed quietly. The war faded into history. The generation that fought it grew old. The men who had been young soldiers became elderly civilians. Some maintained connections through veteran organizations and reunions. Others deliberately disconnected from their military past and lived entirely civilian lives. Aruth was in the latter category. No veteran organizations, no reunions, no continued connection to the military or the war. But the impact of his contribution continued regardless of his personal disconnect. Military historians studying the air war over Europe inevitably discovered the tactical evolution of bomber defensive gunnery during 1943 and 44. Some historians identified Aruth by name as the originator of aggressive engagement tactics. Others described the evolution without attributing it to specific individuals. Either way, the story was documented and preserved. The official records showed clear statistical patterns. Bomber loss rates in early 1943 were catastrophic, frequently exceeding 15% per mission to German targets. By late 1944, loss rates had declined to approximately 5%. Multiple factors contributed, but improved defensive gunnery was consistently identified as significant contributor. The unofficial networks of combat survivors also preserved the story through oral history and personal memoirs. Gunners who had learned Aruth's tactics and survived because of them sometimes mentioned him in interviews or written accounts. The details varied and memories were imperfect after decades, but the core narrative remained consistent. One tail gunner developed better tactics, taught others, saved lives, changed doctrine. One such account appeared in a 1982 book about the 379th Bombardment Group, written by a squadron historian. The book included a chapter about defensive tactics that described Aruth's combat record and teaching influence. The chapter was brief, perhaps 3 pages, but it accurately summarized his contribution. The book had limited circulation, mostly among veterans and military history enthusiasts, but it preserved the story for anyone who cared to look. Aruth never read that book. He didn't know it existed. He had disconnected completely from his military past and had no interest in reliving it through historical accounts. His war was over. His contribution was made. What others wrote about it was irrelevant to his daily life in Sacramento. His health declined gradually through his 70s. The 3 shell fragments still embedded in his shoulder and back caused increasing arthritis and pain as he aged. The cold English winter and the sub-zero temperatures at bomber altitude had damaged his circulation, causing problems decades later. The stress and trauma of combat left psychological scars that never fully healed, despite his refusal to acknowledge them. Margaret died of cancer in 1987 after 35 years of marriage. Aruth was 68, alone, declining in health, living in the same small house in Sacramento. He continued his quiet, solitary life for 3 more years, maintaining minimal social contact, spending his days reading and watching television, and avoiding memories of war. He died on February 20th, 1990, 5 days after his 71st birthday. The cause was heart failure secondary to multiple chronic conditions. He died at home, alone, found by a neighbor who noticed mail accumulating. The death was peaceful and quick. His body was cremated per his written instructions. No funeral service, no memorial, no fuss. His obituary in the Sacramento Bee was brief. Aruth, Michael J., age 71, died February 20th at his residence, born Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, January 3, 1919. Served United States Air Force 1942 through 1962. Retired Master Sergeant, predeceased by wife Margaret in 1987. No survivors, no service per deceased wishes. His ashes were scattered in a local park. The obituary mentioned nothing about combat missions or confirmed kills or medals or tactical innovations or lives saved. The obituary writer didn't know those details. The Veteran Affairs Office that provided the basic information didn't elaborate. Michael Aruth passed from life to death to memory with minimal documentation and no celebration. But the legacy endured independently of recognition or celebration. The tactical changes he pioneered became permanent part of military doctrine. The training methods he developed continued influencing how aerial gunners were taught for decades. The lives he saved through direct teaching and indirect influence numbered in hundreds or thousands, depending on how attribution was calculated. The mathematics of his impact were impressive when compiled. 6 confirmed kills personally achieved during combat. Approximately 800 gunners trained directly during his teaching career. Several thousand more gunners trained indirectly through curriculum changes he influenced. If improved tactics and training increased survival rates by even 10%, that represented hundreds of lives preserved. More speculatively, if Aruth's innovations contributed to overall bomber loss reduction of even 1 percentage point during 1944 and 1945, that represented approximately 300 bombers saved and 3,000 crew members surviving missions they statistically should not have survived. The attribution was imprecise and unprovable, but the order of magnitude seemed reasonable based on documented evidence. The comparison to other military innovations was instructive. Some innovations saved lives through better equipment, better armor, better weapons, better aircraft. These innovations required industrial capacity, engineering expertise, large budgets, long development timelines. Aruth's innovation saved lives through better tactics, better thinking, better training, better decision-making. This required only combat experience, analytical thinking, teaching ability, and willingness to question established procedures. The contrast between complexity of innovation and magnitude of impact was striking. Aruth developed his tactics alone in the cramped tail gunner position of a B-17 over Germany. He tested them through 13 combat missions. He taught them informally to a handful of other gunners. The innovation spread through grassroots networks faster than official channels could have propagated it. Within 18 months, it became standard practice across the entire command. The return on investment was extraordinary. Military historians have identified several factors that made Aruth's innovation successful beyond just the tactical validity of the methods. First, the innovation addressed a real problem that was killing people daily. Tail gunners were dying at catastrophic rates. Anything that improved survival got attention immediately. Second, the innovation was testable and verifiable through direct experience. Gunners who tried it survived more frequently. Results spoke louder than theory. Third, the innovation didn't require special equipment or resources. It used existing weapons more effectively. Implementation cost nothing. Fourth, the innovation spread through trusted networks of combat survivors teaching other survivors. Credibility was inherent. These factors combined to create rapid grassroots adoption, despite official doctrine remaining unchanged for over a year. By the time official doctrine caught up with field practice, thousands of gunners were already using the new tactics, and the statistical evidence was overwhelming. This pattern of bottom-up tactical innovation has appeared repeatedly throughout military history. Frontline soldiers solve problems through practical experimentation. Solutions spread through informal networks. Official doctrine eventually recognizes and codifies what field experience already proved. The pattern is so consistent that military organizations now deliberately create formal mechanisms to capture field innovation rather than waiting for it to propagate organically. Aruth's story became a teaching case at the Air Force Academy and various staff colleges precisely because it illustrated this pattern so clearly. The case study examined what made his innovation successful and what lessons applied to encouraging innovation more broadly within military organizations. The case was taught to officers who would never fly bomber missions, but might face similar situations where established procedures failed and new approaches were needed. The irony was that Aruth himself never knew his story was being taught at military schools decades after his death. He never sought that kind of recognition. He never wrote his memoir or gave interviews to historians or participated in documentary projects. He just fought his war, taught his lessons, retired quietly, lived privately, and died without fanfare. But the impact endured because the impact was real and measurable and documented. The tactics worked. The teaching spread. The lives were saved. These facts existed independently of whether Aruth was remembered or celebrated or honored. The permanent record included his Distinguished Flying Cross citation, his Purple Heart documentation, his combat mission reports, his confirmed kill records, the statistical analyses showing improved survival rates, the curriculum changes he influenced, the testimonials from gunners he trained, and the historical accounts describing tactical evolution. These documents existed in archives and databases, available to anyone researching aerial gunnery or bomber defensive tactics or tactical innovation during World War II. The unofficial record included countless individual stories from men who survived because they learned Aruth's tactics or learned from someone who learned from him. These stories were told at veteran reunions, recorded in oral history projects, written in memoirs, shared with family members. Most of these stories never mentioned Aruth by name because the connections were indirect and anonymous. But the tactics described were his tactics. The survival was enabled by his innovation. The mathematics of influence through teaching networks was exponential. Aruth taught perhaps 40 gunners directly during his combat period. Each of those 40 taught perhaps 10 others during their own combat tours. Each of those 400 taught perhaps 5 more. The progression from 40 to 400 to 2,000 occurred within 12 months. By war's end, perhaps 5,000 to 10,000 gunners were using tactics descended from Aruth's original innovation. Most had no idea who originated the methods. They just knew the tactics worked better than official doctrine. This anonymous, widespread influence was probably more significant than personal recognition would have been. Tactics adopted because they worked, rather than because someone famous endorsed them, gained legitimacy through effectiveness rather than authority. The grassroots spread created genuine believers rather than reluctant followers. The decentralized teaching network was more resilient than any top-down implementation could have been. In the final analysis, Michael Aruth's contribution to winning the Second World War was modest in absolute terms, but significant in relative terms. He didn't win battles. He didn't destroy strategic targets. He didn't change the course of the war, but he helped thousands of individual airmen survive their war. He changed how defensive gunnery was taught and practiced. He demonstrated that tactical innovation could originate from junior enlisted personnel rather than senior officers or civilian analysts. The sum of his impact, measured carefully, included 6 enemy aircraft destroyed, approximately 800 gunners trained directly, several thousand more influenced indirectly through curriculum changes, and perhaps 5 to 10,000 using tactics descended from his innovation by war's end. If improved tactics increased survival rates by even 5 to 10% among those using them, that represented 500 to 1,000 lives preserved. 500 to 1,000 men who returned home rather than dying. 500 to 1,000 families who remained intact rather than receiving telegrams. That was the real measure. Not medals or promotions or historical recognition. Lives saved, families preserved, futures enabled. Michael Aruth fought his war primarily with machine guns, but ultimately with ideas and teaching. The bullets killed a few enemies. The ideas saved many friends. The teaching multiplied the impact exponentially. When military historians enumerate the factors that contributed to Allied victory in World War II, they typically discuss industrial production, technological innovation, strategic planning, tactical execution, and leadership quality. All these factors were important and necessary, but wars are also won through countless small innovations and improvements developed by individual soldiers solving immediate problems. Aruth was one such soldier. His innovation was one such improvement. Aggregate thousands of similar innovations across millions of individual soldiers, and the cumulative effect becomes substantial. No single innovation won the war, but the sum of all innovations, improvements, and tactical adaptations contributed materially to the efficiency of the war effort and the ultimate victory. Michael Aruth's name won't appear in high school history textbooks. His story won't be featured in Hollywood movies. His contribution won't be commemorated with monuments or museums. But for several hundred men who survived the air war over Europe because they learned tactics he pioneered, and for their children and grandchildren who existed because those men survived, Michael Aruth's contribution was everything. That's how history actually works. Not through famous generals and celebrated heroes, though those exist, but primarily through unknown individuals making small improvements that aggregate into large effects. One tail gunner questioned doctrine, developed alternatives, tested under fire, taught others, saved lives, changed tactics. Multiply that by thousands of similar stories across all combat branches and all theaters, and the cumulative effect becomes the difference between victory and defeat. Michael Aruth fought his war well. He survived. He taught others to survive. He changed how his war was fought in one small domain. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything he could have contributed. When he died alone in Sacramento in 1990, he died having made a difference that endured beyond his memory and recognition. The final accounting of Michael Aruth's life and impact produces a ledger of achievement measured not in glory, but in survival. 13 combat missions flown, 6 aircraft destroyed, 3 shell fragments permanently embedded, 800 gunners trained directly, thousands influenced indirectly. 500 to 1,000 lives preserved. Tactical doctrine changed. Military training improved. War fought more effectively. That ledger balances positively. Michael Aruth paid the price of combat through wounds and trauma. He collected the reward through survival and the knowledge that others survived because of what he taught. The trade was acceptable, the outcome was good, the contribution was real. This is how anonymous heroes change the world, not through dramatic individual actions witnessed by millions, but through small innovations taught to dozens who teach hundreds, who teach thousands. The amplification through teaching networks creates impact far beyond what any individual could achieve alone. Michael Aruth understood this instinctively. He fought when fighting was required, but he taught whenever possible because teaching multiplied impact. When the final count is compiled and the ultimate tally is recorded, Michael Aruth saved more lives through teaching than through fighting. That's the true legacy. That's the enduring contribution. That's the measure of a life well lived, despite the absence of recognition or celebration. Some men seek glory, others seek survival. Michael Aruth sought to help others survive. In that seeking, he succeeded completely. That success